We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a agenda, like 2, 3, 4, 5 speakers, and I think it's a exciting, learn about so many things. And we have, I wanted to, before we get started with the first presentation, I was hoping that we can launch everything this month, but we might have to do it next month. We ordered some Apple Minis. You guys have copies of handouts, and so what we were going to try to do is either bring your own device or have about 25 or 30 Apple Minis, so that when you come in, you check them in, and then you see everything electronically, as opposed to us having to make tons of paper and kill trees. So we're going to start doing that as soon as we get those minis here. So we'll kind of have them as you come in. The first 25 or 30 folks will be able to do that, or you can bring your own device and you'll be able to follow it. I want to introduce Tim Porter. He designed our app where you can download all the information and also can get the video stream on there. So if you're somewhere remote and you just, don't have anything to do and you just want to, listen to Amanda Bronson talk about school funding and what she said, so you can just download it on there or look at the documents so he's going to tell you a little bit about it, how to do that. And he's out of San Antonio, and he's been doing a great job with some of our app development, and so he'll tell you all about it. Tim, good morning.
Good morning. How everybody doing? Good. Hope you guys having a great morning. Thank you for having me here, Jesus. So this morning we're going to showcase the School Finance Council mobile app. Has anybody downloaded the previous version yet? Okay, great. If you have, this is the new version. Okay, so you're going to be able to go to their website, and you're going to be able to click straight on the application. And now what it's going to do is going to take you to where, if you have an Apple device or you have an Android device, you'll just be able to click on the link. And as you can see here, it's going to redirect you to the App Store based on your device, and you can just install it straight from the App Store. Okay? So it's developed for both platforms, Apple and Android. And again, straight from that link and going to their website, you're going to be able to install it straight from there. So like I have it on my Android, when I clicked on the link, it just have it to where then I can click install and then install it on my device. Okay? On my iPad, and I'm going to run through the app pretty quickly. Here's what it would look like on my iPad. So this is going to be a great communication tool for the School Finance Council to keep you guys up to date on everything that's going on. So let's just talk about a few things real fast. If you click on schedule, you'll be able to register for different sessions and different things like that. You're going to be able to get resources and presentations right in the palm of your hand now. So it's all going to be updated live to where, like you said, they don't have to kill many trees. Let's just say that you're using the application and you're looking for a specific school or something like that. You're going to be able to go here to members, and you're going to see here in a second, we're pulling it from the database, and all of the schools are going to show up, and you can get information about the school. And now with mobile applications, let's just say that you wanted to visit their website, email someone, or you wanted to say, hey, I'm over here in this part of Houston, how do I get there? Now we can GPS you directly to where you need to go for all the schools. And then we're going to come down here to the Center for Safe and Secure Schools. All of you guys' schools are in here. So any updated information that you want to pass to them, they can update all that information. But again, very similar to where you can go in here, and again, GPS and everything, you're going to be able to get straight to that school. Okay? From a HCDE transparency standpoint, you have all the information to where you can click down and you can click out on these links and get to more information. And then You're going to be able to see all of ACDE services now in the palm of your hand. Okay? So you don't always have to go to the website. You have it right here now. And again, you can click on the link and get additional information. And then also, as you guys are interacting and doing different online surveys, you're going to be able to now do the survey straight from the application. And it's going to go straight to ACDE.
Those are for when we over time, we'll send you an email about, we're going to do a survey about salary increases or about health insurance and stuff like that. So we'll do it through here, and it's kind of similar to what's it, Monkey?
Survey Monkey.
Survey Monkey, very similar to that, and so we'll be able to capture all of one place.
Yes. So, so with that, this is the new application.
Can you click on the video, and because that's where you'll see that piece.
Yeah, so video, when they start here, like here, you go to their YouTube channel, and you'll be able to see all the videos and everything straight from here, straight from the device now. Okay. And then the amazing thing that I end with is, how many people here have a smartphone, have an iPad, have a smart device? Everyone. So we all love push notification. Okay. So now with different updates and things that comes out from the School Finance Council, they're going to be able to update you guys now using push notification. So you can stay up to date and alert and everything that's going on. Okay? So again, we're Application Studio. We're a mobile application development company out of San Antonio, Texas. Our claim to fame is we've developed the Stop Bullies anti-bullying app. So we feel very privileged and honored to be working with ACDE. And again, thank you guys for the time.
By the way, that bullying app, we offered it to everybody that's in the school district that's a member. It's free for, I think, 3 schools. And so we offered it to whoever your representative is on the safe and secure schools. They should know about it. But if they don't, let them know, because it will be free. But he's developed it and take advantage of that application.
Yeah, it's been developed now in 4 different languages. We're going to Central Europe, Mexico, and Peru, and we're getting ready to put it into Sci-Fi.
To get to the app, it's when you click on School Finance Council. This is where you go in to register. That's where that click on is. You normally go to where you have the session, so you click on there to do the registration for the session, so it's in the same place. Okay, well, we're excited that Amanda and Cassie are here, and they're going to talk to you about updates on different things on funding, so won't take any longer, so please help me welcome Amanda and Cassie.
So thank you guys for having us out this morning. I'm Amanda Brownson, Director of State Funding at TEA, and this is Cassie Huggins, and she runs our bond guarantee program as well as QZAB and QSCAB program. So she's going to talk to you a little bit about that as we go along. Is there like a... So I'm going to start out with some news and updates, let you know what we've incorporated into your current summary of finance, what changes you can expect for next year, and just a few little updates from TEA. Back on Cassie. And then I'm going to go over a few things about the summary of finance and introduce you to some new documents that we've put out that describe what our data sources are for the summary of finance, when we update that, and where we get the data, so that you can hopefully predict changes to cash flow and things, and understand our timelines and data sources a little bit better. Talk to you a little bit about Chapter 41 processes, a little bit about some things going on in the world of IFA and EDA, and then Cassie's going to kind of give you a facilities update. So I just put this up to let you know this is these are the folks you can call on in the Division of State Funding that do all of the work related to Chapter 41 and Chapter 42 of the Education Code and your state funding programs. And some of those folks are in blue. And those are people in our division who have been in their current position for 1 year or less. And so I just put that up to say, if you're struggling a little bit to remember who you should call about what, well, there's a reason for that. And some of them have been at the agency for a while, but they're now in a position that's different from what they used to be doing. For example, Rob Caudill has been at the agency for a long time, but he's now taken over our facilities funding standards, and in fact, he's about to embark on the process of updating those standards. Rochelle Kingsley's switched over so that she's now a SAS programmer for us. Jackie Cree has been doing IFA and EDA now for almost a year. She came right about the same time I did. And Kim Wall, who used to be doing compensatory education funding and optional school day and year, is now over doing Chapter 41 wealth equalization. And so anyway, we've had a little bit of moving around, but I think things have settled out now. We've got a good, strong team there. And they are ready to answer your questions and help you if you're having trouble. All their numbers are up on the school finance webpage, so you can call them if you need to. Okay, go ahead. So in terms of things that have changed recently on the summary of finance, just to let you know, in February, both the LPE side of your summary of finance and the DPE side was updated to reflect any tax rate changes you made. And we get calls fairly regularly saying, I had a TRE and brought my rate up to $1.17. When will my state aid reflect that? And the answer is always in February. You don't need to do anything special except that you need to make sure that your appraisal district correctly reports your new tax rate to the controller's office on what we call the self-report file. That's our data source every February. And so we will update your tax rate, and then if we update your tax rate, we'll proportionately change your tax collections to go with the changed tax rate. So be watching for that. It's always a smart idea to go in and check your summary of finance at the end of February and just verify that that rate is correct. We have had occasionally appraisal districts report the wrong rate, and that can throw off your summary fairly substantially. So we try to look and make sure they seem reasonable to us, but you're going to know better than we are whether or not that data is incorrect. We've also pulled in compensatory education data, so you can now open your summary of finance and there will be a hot link there so that you can pull up that report that shows your free and reduced price lunch counts. And so it's always smart to go and look at that and verify that that's accurate. We work pretty hard. We get data from the Department of Ag, and again, we try to do reasonableness checks. And so if you have 2 or 3 months that seem substantially off from the rest of your year's worth of data, we'll kick that out and you'll be getting a call from us. But that's kind of our limit in terms of verifying the accuracy of that data, so we call on you to help us with that. We have updated the attendance counts only on the DPE side now to reflect your fall enrollment data so that you can begin to start seeing variation between the LPE and DPE side. That'll give you a preview of settle up. And we've also incorporated your budgeted tax collections. So right now, when we compare the LPE column to the DPE column, it looks like we are overpaying to the tune of about $150 million. So our current anticipation is that next year, when we go into the 14-15 school year, there will be a settle up in the state's favor on a statewide basis of about $150 million. Of course, that's going to vary substantially from district to district. And just as a reminder, you may have seen this slide before, but these are your funding elements. We put up the final year of last biennium and then the 2 years of the coming biennium. You'll see an additional increase in the basic allotment next year, where we take it up to $5,040. And then the equalized wealth level for Tier 1 for your first, your tax collections up to your compressed tax rate goes up corresponding to the basic allotment. So the equalized wealth level will go up to $504,000. But the equalized wealth level on that second group of collections stays at $319,500. So when we get ready to send our preliminary identification of Chapter 41 districts, the equalized wealth level that we have to look at is that lower level of $319,500. Everybody with a wealth per WADA greater than $319,500 will get a letter from us saying, welcome to Chapter 41 status. Probably one of the most common questions I get, and I'm very sympathetic, but I don't have a solution for you, is my tax rate will not exceed the compressed rate, and my equalized wealth level is only $320,000, so I'm not going to owe any recapture. Can you please leave me alone, right? And stop sending me this paperwork. And the answer is no. We have to treat you like you're going to owe us recapture, and go through all of those procedures once you cross that threshold of $319,500. And the reason is that we have to prepare to collect recapture from you before we know what your tax rate's going to be. And before, in fact, even your board adopts it. And so you don't really even with certainty know what the tax rate's going to be because your board has to make that decision. And so we have to kind of line everything up and prepare to collect recapture, even if it turns out to be the case that you may not end up owing us anything because you're not taxing in that lower wealth level zone. So that's why that happens. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the processes and procedures around Chapter 41. How many of you are Chapter 41 districts in here? I think you might be next year. Okay. So we'll talk a little about that. Guaranteed yield on the 6 golden pennies will increase slightly next year, and that's because it has to track the Austin yield, so it's going up to $61.86. But the guaranteed yield on the last pennies up to $1.17 stays the same at $31.95. That corresponds to the equalized wealth level of $319,500 there. The regular program adjustment factor is back at 1 both this year and next year, and then it's repealed. So the legislature would have to take action to reinstate that. So one thing that you'll notice as a function of that is your WAD account should stop bouncing around. You should notice a more consistent relationship between your attendance and your count of students in weighted average daily attendance. And then the last factor is the target revenue adjustment factor will be the same next year as it was this year at 0.9263. Couple of just reminders. Next year, there was a $330 million appropriation that we received to grant, and they say this in the rider, one-time assistance to help districts cover the increased TRS cost associated with Senate Bill 1458. Right now, we're estimating that allocation to be $67.55. It's appropriations limited, so we can only spend $330 million. We are going to roll that into your summary of finance and pay it out along with the regular payment schedule. There's a line on the other programs detail report that we're not using, so we're going to use it for that. One thing to just note about that is right now we estimate it will be $67.55, but we don't have final attendance yet. So when we get final attendance, if statewide attendance turns out to be a little bit lower than estimated, we'll be able to raise that amount in order to spend the full $330 million. If statewide attendance turns out to be a little bit higher than estimated, we'll have to lower it just a little bit in order to not overspend the $330 million. But our goal will be to just spend that full appropriation.
Amanda?
Yes?
What was the rationale for them only funding it for 1 year?
They are calling it transition assistance. And so,
yeah, that's a fancy word for.
So it's sort of, I think
do you think in 2015 when they come back, because they got all this money in Austin, that they'll fund it?
You know, if I were in your shoes planning, I would not plan for it to be there. There may be other formula changes, but the fact that they labeled it one time and they would have to pass statute to continue it, I mean, they could. That would be a decision of the legislature. But since they've labeled it one-time assistance, I would probably.
What was the reason behind Simple?
TRS?
I think trying to maintain the health of the TRS fund.
But if you're a district like Austin ISD who pays TRS and Social Security, you're exempt from it.
You are exempt from
Okay,
the.
but again, what's the rationale? That was
So they
Austin
could-
ISD's decision in 19.
Pete, they did it until they fund my retirement.
I'm glad it's funny. And speak highly of me. I'll work hard and keep you going. I mean, I just understand the rationale of the whole Senate bill.
I think it was.
Everybody pays it or no one
About
pays it. Why, if you're paying Social Security, that's a decision that district made, local decision. Why does it have to?
It's goofy. Or it's goofy to me.
The other point, just to remind you, is that we have a second round of supplemental kindergarten funding next year. You may have noticed this year that sometime in October, I think you got some funds associated with the pre-K program. They're no longer funding those old pre-K grants that some districts used to get, but not all districts got, that were associated really with running a full-day pre-K program. But instead, they directed us to take that appropriation and give it to all districts who have pre-K students, and we give it out based on pre-K ADA, and we'll use prior year pre-K ADA because it's an appropriations limited amount, and we can't overspend our appropriations. That's why we use prior year attendance. Yes, ma'am.
Back to the TRS funding. Is that next year?
That will be next year on your summary of finance coming out along with your regular FSP payments. Any other questions?
Yeah, the basic allotment is probably going up in the next biennium.
It
right?
could.
In order to get people off of hold harmless.
It could, and if it does,
Will benefit.
that would be a source of funding that you could use to, right. Yes.
How long have we been at 319.5?
That's been since House Bill 1 passed for the 2006-07 school year. So that, they raised the basic allotment in Tier 1, but they've left the 319.5 and 31.95. Any other questions? Okay. In terms of facilities funding, how many of you get either EDA or IFA in here? Okay, just like to know for whom this is relevant. We've been processing some value appeals that had made their way over to the M&O side, but never made their way over to the INS side of the coin. And so if you look at your payment ledgers, probably in particular 910 through 1213, you may notice some recent adjustments on IFA and EDA that have been done in order to reflect value appeals in those two programs. We also have some negative balances that are sitting on the ledgers, especially on the EDA side, but in many cases your districts have become wealthy enough that you've outgrown the program. And it's been asked, well, can we just leave those there? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. We can't just leave a negative balance on the ledger if you've been overpaid. The state has to have some way of recovering that overpayment. So there are kind of two options. What our rules say are that we should just roll that negative balance over to the foundation side and recover it out of M&O funds. So that's kind of what our automatic will be. And if you're one of these districts, by the way, we've sent you a letter, so you should know that it's coming. If you don't want us to roll this over to the M&O side and you see a negative balance sitting on your payment ledger, you can call us and make a payment, and we can handle it that way. The only thing I would ask is if you're going to make a payment, call us ahead of time. Let us know to be watching for it, because a lot of times what can happen is most of the payments we get are Chapter 41 payments. And so if we don't get all the paperwork filled out correctly and watch for it and make sure it hits the right ledger, it can go off onto the Chapter 41 ledger somewhere, and if your district's not Chapter 41, hunt it down and make sure you get credit for the payment you made. So that'll just help us make sure your books stay clean. And we are doing this probably over the summer sometime, just for those districts who no longer get EDA to clean those ledgers up. So you should know about it if you're one of these districts. 2013-14 IFA and EDA reports have been updated to reflect failure to meet local share. Sometimes districts have been reducing their INS rate very significantly, sometimes coincidental to increasing their M&O rate. But statute says that you have to have sufficient collections on your INS tax rate to meet your local share of IFA and EDA. And if you don't, we are supposed to proportionately dock your state aid. For years and years, nobody ever had insufficient collections, but the last few years we've noticed there are a handful of districts who do have insufficient collections, and so we've now updated the IFA and EDA reports so you'll be able to see that if you're one of those districts. And it should be popping up now on your 13-14 reports. if this applies to you. We have decided to implement it on the DPE side only, and that's because we didn't want to use somebody's budgeted tax collections that were insufficient and dock their state aid inappropriately when maybe they have raised that item straight back up and we're going to have sufficient collections. So we're going to give you the warning on the DPE side, but then at final, there will be that reduction if you have insufficient collections. So just be sure you're monitoring that. And then also, let's be sure refunding amendments are up to date, especially for IFA. And I'll show you that on the next slide. If you open your IFA screen after you log into Tees, you might have a note here that gives you these debt instruments that need to be, where we are missing refunding amendments. If we're missing refunding amendments, you need to get those into us because we won't give you state aid on those, on that debt until we have the amendment in. If you go to the next slide, I think I have some examples. This is what an IFA refunding amendment looks like. We'd like to get away from these paper amendments. That is our goal, but it may take some time to get the IT side of the equation working well before we can do that. This is what your IFA page will look like if you're one of these districts who hasn't gotten us an amendment or we haven't processed an amendment. You'll see for this district in round 1, they have 3 bonds, so this bond's been refunded twice. In the third bond, they made, there's $9,000 worth of payments, but the state share is 0 and it's got an asterisk there. And then a little fine print at the bottom, it says something about you may be getting 0 state share because we don't have a refunding amendment. And so just watch for those zeros with the asterisks, and that probably means you need to get us an amendment and we can get that process for you. And this is just I thought it was interesting. Al McKenzie put this together in our office. This shows you the debt that's been issued, new debt, as well as refundings over the last decade. And you can see that 2012 and 2013, especially 2013, we had a lot of amendments and a lot of refundings out in the world. And that's because interest rates were so low that it made sense for folks to refund. But anyway, that's produced a whole lot of activity on the IFA side of the shop over at TEA because kind of a record amount of refundings there. I want to take you through a little bit about our timelines and the data sources that we use to get your information updated. As you know, the Summary of Finance shows you the funding elements associated with Foundation School Programs State Aid for school districts and charter schools. We publish the preliminary Summary of Finance in the summertime before the school year begins, and we'll do several iterations. One thing you may not know is we'll always do a monthly run, so you'll get a new run every month. It may not post if nothing changed, but we'll do that every month before we make payments. And we consider our payment cycles to be preliminary, near final, and final. Right now we're in the preliminary cycle for 2013-14. We're in the near final cycle for 2012-2013. We have reformatted both the Summary of Finance and the Cost of Recapture reports because the agencies changed the software that we're using, and so we have to go back and reprogram all of those old reports. The 2009-10 through 2011-12 are now being rewritten to match our new formats that are currently showing up on 12-13 and 13-14. Now when you click on the hot links inside your Summary of Finance, it's going to open up a new window so that you can have multiple portions of your Summary of Finance open at once. If it's been irritating you that when you right click on your summary and hit print and it comes out all gray and yucky, and click on the little printer icon up in the top instead, and that will export it to PDF, and then click print and you'll get a pretty clean copy if you're tired of using up all that ink. It's a little thing, but it kind of grates on you after a while. So as you know, probably LPE, when we talk about LPE, that stands for Legislative Payment Estimate, and those are the set of calculations that we're going to use to pay you between September and August of the current school year. We rarely make changes to the LPE side of the equation during the year, and that's so that we can be certain about what our appropriation is and that we're going to have sufficient funds to get everyone paid. couple of reasons that we will make changes are, for example, when we pull in compensatory education data or when we pull in the new tax rate data. But largely your LPE payment estimate should be fairly static. Once we get to the final August payment, we don't change the LPE side anymore, and then the DPE side becomes what is generating cash to the
Hey, Amanda,
district.
on the previous page, what is COR?
Cost of recapture.
Oh, no,
Sorry. Doesn't apply to you.
We'll let you.
So then we'll update DPE data during and after the school year as they become available, and changes to the DPE side don't affect cash flow until that school year is closed out, but they are used to estimate setup for you. Go ahead, Cassie. So we'll do near final beginning in September. When we get your summer PEMS attendance data rolled in and your tax information survey data rolled in, and really after near final, things should be very close to where you're going to ultimately end up, because it's that summer attendance data and the tax information survey data that create the largest differences between LPE and DPE. But we will then do final in April of the following year when we get your J1 collections from your annual audit report. And that's our ultimate source data for collections for school districts. Once we do final or a near final run, we'll engage in the process of settle up. If we have underpaid you, and we discover when we pull in the more recent data that you earn more than we have paid you, we'll issue a payment. If we've overpaid you, we'll roll that negative balance to the next year and reduce funding going out to your district in the subsequent school year. And so that's typically how that works. Wanted to just point you to this document that's in your packet. FSP, Summary of Finances, Data Elements, Sources, and Timelines. What we've tried to do is capture here for all of the major data elements what is our source data in the LPE column, in the DPE column, and then how does it change at near final and final, so that you can sort of predict when we change data and where that data comes from. And so this is up on our website. It still has a draft watermark on it. We think we're getting ready to take that off. We've made a couple of little updates to it, but I think we're feeling fairly comfortable with where this is right now. If you notice anything that causes questions or concerns, let us know, but I think we're feeling pretty good about it at this point. Cassie, I'm going to take you through a couple of examples. So we start out with average daily attendance. LPE, average daily attendance, comes from the pupil projections that your district submits to us prior to each session of the legislature. And then you submit for us 2 years worth of attendance data at once, and that's what we will use to pay you during the next 2 years. So districts, sometimes you'll call and express frustration at the bad student counts that we're using to pay your districts, but that ultimately came from you. So just take that pupil projections process very seriously when you do that, because you're going to be stuck with those numbers for 2 years. We will make downward adjustments for you. If you call us and say, you are way overpaying us and I don't feel comfortable having this much money that I know I'm not going to get to keep, and districts do call us with that every once in a while, we will make a downward adjustment for you as kind of a courtesy, but we can't make upward adjustments, which frustrates you all from time to time, but that's because we have to make sure we don't overspend the money that was appropriated to us. We've got to make sure we have enough money to last us through those 2 years. Nobody wants us to have to go into proration, so that's what that is. CPTDs are largely, since that's a prior year state funding value, we largely know what that is when we get ready to run the preliminary summary of finances. The collections number, though, is kind of interesting. For the first year of the biennium, we will take the value growth assumptions that the legislature adopted when they wrote the appropriations bill. It'll say in the appropriations bill, we think values are going to grow by 3% in the first year of the biennium and an additional 3.2% in the second year of the biennium. We'll take that percentage and apply it to the best collections number we have for your district at the time, which would be DPE collections in the second year of the biennium. And just know that DPE collections in the second year of the biennium, that comes from your budgeted data. So your PEMS budgeted tax collection data then gets inflated for statewide property value growth, and that's the number that goes in on the LPE side of the equation when we run your preliminary summary of finance. So be mindful of that when you submit your PEMS budget data. You want that number to be as accurate as it can be. Now, the statewide average value increase is not going to be correct for any given individual district. It's meant to be roughly correct on a statewide basis, so there will always be some settled up implications there. Payment ledgers, just really quickly. We recommend that you look at your payment ledgers on a regular basis. You all know where to go to get your payment ledger. You go to the same place you would go to look at your summary of finance, but select payment ledgers. And you can get IFA, EDA, ASF, FSP, all their individual payment ledgers for all of those. And we show you what your current year allotment is, any adjustments that we've had to make, any payments we've made to you, and then what your remaining balance is. So that's our ultimate data source, and we recommend you look at them regularly. And here's what one looks like. This is Northeast ISD. One thing that I think confuses people just based on calls that we take is there's a paid to date column over on the right that's a cumulative amount. That's everything we paid you for that year. But the adjustments column is not cumulative. And so if you're trying to figure out how we're coming up with the remaining balance number in the bottom right hand corner, you have to sum all of the adjustments in that adjustments column so that you make sure you're capturing every adjustment we've made. Typically the adjustments are most often related to settle up from the prior year. So like for Northeast, you can see right now, we estimate their annual entitlements $144 million, but we've had to bring in a little over $11 million in negative balances from the prior year. That's going to reduce this year's payments. Any questions about the payment ledgers? And all those current allotments are hot linked, so you can click on it and see the summary of finance calculations that produce that. So like y'all will call sometimes and say, well, why the drop or why the increase in my allotment? And what we do is open that run and open the run before it and then look at what changed. And you can do that too. A little bit on chapter 41. So as we talked about before, not all districts that are identified as chapter 41 will owe us recapture. And we're going to talk a little bit about what your options are. For 13-14, 395 school districts were identified as chapter 41. By the time we got through with getting final property values and accounting for the fact that some districts take in transfers but don't charge tuition, that number had dropped to 332 that remain. And total recapture costs went from $1.069 billion in 12-13 up to $1.131 billion in 13-14. Just remember, there's one Kim Wall who does our chapter 41 districts and almost 400 chapter 41 districts. So she's in charge of a lot of paperwork going back and forth. So be patient with her, but she does a real good job, I think, of getting back to you guys if you have questions. The netting option, for those of you who are identified as chapter 41 but don't know any recapture or owe very little recapture, the netting option makes the most sense. You don't have to call a chapter 41 election. What the netting option means is simply you look at your chapter 41 amount that you owe us and it's less than what we owe you under chapter 42. And so you tell us, just withhold state aid rather than making us send you a check and then you send us money. Yes?
So if you've never conducted the chapter 41 election before,
Yes.
and you become eligible now, you don't have to call an election if you're just going to net.
That's correct. If you've never, if you're newly chapter 41 as of 06 or later, and what you owe us is less than what we owe you, and we check that, you don't have to call an election, and you can send us what we call, there's a separate contract in the chapter 41 manual that is option 3, netting, no election required. And so send us that contract. Two things here that are really important. One is that you need to send us the right contract. If you want to net, send us the contract that says netting. And when you go into the chapter 41 module, you need to, there's a couple of little radio buttons. You need to pick the radio button that says you want to net. And otherwise, we won't withhold your state aid. you'll rack up a balance in Chapter 41, we'll call you and fuss at you to pay us the balance, and you'll say, but I've never held an election, and it's kind of a mess, and we work it out, but it's really good if you can send us the right contract and select the right option so that we actually do net your state aid. They changed the law last session. It used to be you could only net if your ASATR was greater than your recapture amount. Now you can net if any Chapter 42 funds, we don't count ASF, but your Chapter 42 money net of ASF, if it's bigger than what you owe us, you can do that. You still have to send some paperwork into TEA, but you don't have to have an election, so that's a good option for you. And that's, yeah. Just a reminder, the ASATR rule for how we make those calculations has been adopted. Probably the only real substantive change there was if you're a Chapter 41 district, we will compare your transportation allotment in the current year to your transportation allotment in 9-10 and apply that difference to your target revenue calculation. Another change that's happened in the Chapter 41 world is you'll now notice when you open up your cost of recapture report, there are two columns, a DPE side and an LPE side, just like Chapter 42. And the reason is, when we calculate ASATR for a Chapter 41 district, we take your target revenue and we subtract your M&O tax collections minus recapture plus state aid. And what we're doing is we're comparing what revenue do you have available this year to what your target revenue was. Well, what was happening to some districts is they were going into the module for their Chapter 41 calculation and telling us our collections are going to come in much higher than you think, TEA, and their recapture cost was going way up, and they were paying us that higher recapture. But over on the Chapter 42 side, we were looking at our estimated collections and your really high recapture amount, and that was a mismatch that was creating some really significant settle-up amounts for some districts, and that kind of can get you into some trouble. So in order to minimize these really big settle-up amounts, we've created an LPE recapture column, and the only reason we use it is to pull over into the ASATR report on the Chapter 42 side of the world, so that the student counts and the tax collections that we're using for Chapter 41 and for Chapter 42 match. And our hope is that that will minimize some of the big settle-ups that we were seeing, and so far it looks like that's working well. You can still pay recapture based on the DPE side and data you input into the module, so that doesn't change. And that's just explaining that, so you can go ahead and so the implication of this really, if you're just kind of cut to the bottom line here, is if you estimate higher collections locally than we recognize in LPE, over on the Chapter 42 side, we're not going to recognize either the collections or the higher recapture. For Chapter 42 purposes, everything's going to be based on the same consistent set of estimates. And that's what we hope will help out with some of this settle-up. And now, any questions about any of that? If not, I'm going to bring Cassie up to talk about some bond-related issues. Okay.
Good morning. I administer the Qualified School Construction Bond Program, which we affectionately call QSCAB, the Qualified Zone Academy Bond Program, which we affectionately call QZAB, and they can often get really confused for some reason. You go forward. So first of all, I'm going to start with the QSCAB, Qualified School Construction Bond. For some reason lately, I've been getting a lot of calls about applications for that program, and we are no longer accepting applications. The deadline for that was June 30th, 2010. And that's the last time we accepted any applications. However, at that time, they created a waiting list. And so as allocations are freed up by the district either giving it back to us or not issuing as much as they thought they were, and filling from that waiting list, but we're not adding to the waiting list. So it's still active. People are still getting letters saying we have a QSCAB authorization. I try to call the district before I issue that letter to make sure they still want it, because sometimes like 4 years later, they don't want it anymore. But we do have a lot of districts that have an authorization that they haven't used, and it expires 1 year after the time that you get it. And then we're extending extensions at 180 days at a time right now. We may change that and go a little further. But we've been pretty lax on that. So we've let people's deadline expire, and then we'll go ahead and issue an extension. And we're going to tighten that up a little bit. So if you have a current QSCAB authorization, pay attention to what that deadline is. If you're going to need an extension, ask me for it before that deadline comes.
Kathy,
Yes, sir.
on the waiting list,
Yes,
are
sir.
there two separate waiting lists for ISDs and charters?
Yes,
or is it
sir.
just one?
No, two separate lists. I think on the charter club, I've only got about 4 left on that waiting list, but I've got quite a few school districts. I did just recently free up about 18 million. And so there'll be about 3 or 4 districts that are about to get a letter authorizing them to issue QSCAB debt. And that's all I have on QSCAB, if anybody has any questions. And then we have the qualified zone academy bonds are current. We currently have an authorization of a remaining of 25 million. Here I have 31,825 with that pending application, but that pending application was approved. So it's right at 25 million. I also have a little bit left in the authorization that would expire at the end of this fiscal year. So if you have a small project, I think it's about $1.5 million, $1.4 million. If you had something that you knew that you could close by the end of this year, we could still use that authorization. One thing, the application is on our website, but just be sure that they're complete and that they're signed by the superintendent. And clearly identify any new academic program that you have and provide the assurance of the business contribution with the application. A lot of times, if you read the application, you have to tell how the academic program was developed with a business. You have to tell how that is going to increase graduation rates, and there's certain criteria that it has to meet. Just be sure that when you fill out that application that you answer those questions. Make sure that you've told me how you developed it with business and how it's going to do the things that the QSAB program is set up for. I also administer the bond guarantee program. The biggest change in that right now is that we are about to begin to accept applications to guarantee the bonds of charter schools. We're expecting that on Monday we'll roll out that application, and they'll get their first notifications on the 15th business day of April. Are there any charter schools here, or is this all ISDs? That's not important to you, except that it is out there now. In order to even get in the door, they have to already have an investment grade credit rating and have operated a charter school for at least 3 years with students in attendance. And they have to have audits for the last 3 years with unmodified or unqualified opinions. And there are some accountability and accreditation rating criteria. So I know that a lot of people are anticipating that this is going to cause the program to be less stable. But we put in some stopgaps to make sure that it remains as viable as it's always been. I think that's all I've got. No. Okay, we skipped a step. And just in general for the bond guarantee program, applications for new money issues or combination new money and refunding issues are all grouped together. So everything that I receive in one calendar month is grouped together. And then notifications are sent out the 15th business day of the following month. So it's not a first come, first served basis. If we were at capacity or close to capacity, it would be based on wealth, who would get the guarantee. But refunding issues are processed as they're received. They have to have been previously guaranteed by the PSF in order to qualify for refunding unless they were issued during the 2009 period when the program closed down. They have to have a present value savings to the district, and you can't extend the maturity of the original issue. Any questions on any of those? All right, well, thank you.
Next, we have Jesse Thompson, and he has an exciting information and news about the Houston economy. And I think this is he's been here, three or four times already. And every year, again, he updates the information about how are we doing here. And it's really a great importance to you as you start building budgets and kind of look at, okay, what is the economy doing so that you can help you with your presentation. So please help welcome Jesse Thompson with Dallas Federal Reserve Bank.
We prefer to say the Houston branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas.
There you go. Please help me welcome him.
I know you're all terribly excited to look at graphs ahead of between now and lunch. That's usually the most enviable position a presenter can be in, is to present graphs before lunch. I hope I can make it interesting. Before I get started, I do have to do a little bit of housekeeping. Am I coming through okay audio-wise? A little bit of housekeeping that my opinions are mine and mine alone, and not necessarily representative of the views of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Bank Presidents, Officers, or associated with the Federal Reserve in every shape or form. So you want the full one? The one I get to college students? Okay. Had a couple of risk management associations have had conferences recently, and I give a much longer spiel, much more quickly, and that was well received. We economists take pride in these moments when we're actually considered funny. So, talking about Houston. Houston has had a phenomenal ride in the last couple of years. We have outperformed the most other metros in the country by wide margins in terms of job growth, in terms of wage growth, and just broader economic levels of activity, which we're going to talk about as we move along. If you look in the various journals that are out there and the lists that are provided, say best city for this or best city for that or fastest growing, Houston is always very, very highly ranked now, which is sort of a change from always being at the bottom of all the rankings just a few years ago. It's amazing what a difference a few years can make. So, first, let's paint this picture. I'm going to talk about sort of high-level economy stuff, economic activity, employment. I'm going to talk about the real estate markets, and then I'm going to go into sort of the major drivers. What are the key things that if you look at them, they frame what is happening in the Houston economy. But let's start off at very high altitude. Economic activity. We do not have a very good measure of GDP, or gross domestic product, for cities. But we do have this thing called coincident index of economic indicators. I'm not going to go into what that is, what that entails. Suffice to say that the economy is more than jobs, it's more than unemployment or employment, it's more than GDP. There's this concept, it's an amorphous thing, and it moves. And this is a pretty good index of how it's moving. And what you see here starting in January 2010 on this graph, you see Houston and the US, both in terms of economic activity, ticking back up, coming out of the Great Recession. But particularly see Houston continue to accelerate all into 2012, where growth and activity is consistently strong, and whereas the US kind of keeps trying to bump up above 2% growth, but it just can't quite do it. The most recent data is starting to look a little bit more promising for the US, and there's some very good reason for that. If anything, just based off this graph alone, what you should already start to see, because we're humans and we like to impose patterns on things, as you see a big uptick, you see things doing really well in 2011, growing really well in 2012, but then in 2013, not quite as well. And that is going to be the theme for today. The theme today is slowing down. So first off, labor market conditions. Now I say we're human beings, we like to impose patterns, especially nice rhythmic patterns. I mean, we call this the business cycle. This is employment in Houston. And you can, for those of you who remember the days, say 1992, 91, there was a recession there. Early 2000s, we had a recession there. And then, of course, the Great Recession. And so you might say that, you might look at this pattern, and you see this big bounce, and start to worry. And first, when you put you at ease, there is nothing to indicate that we are heading towards contraction in the immediate future in the region at all. If anything, what the data is showing us is that this slowdown that we're seeing in employment growth, this slowdown that has been slowly making its way through all of our various industries of employment, is a return to a more normal business cycle. We had what was called a resource shock in economics. All of a sudden, we had vast oceans of hydrocarbons in the underground that we could get at. And being the energy capital of the world, We benefited disproportionately from that, and that really propped us up above what you would consider normal economic activities. And now that technology is maturing, and we're returning to more normal business cycle patterns. So, what does that look like? Here's more evidence of slowing down. So this is new job advertisements from the Help Wanted Online Index. If you go to the Conference Board website, they have this data, Help Wanted Online. They actually produced one for Houston specifically, one of the few major metropolitan areas that they produced this for, because we are so large. What is it? This is one of our best measures of labor demand. New job advertisements. You see Houston, this is Houston versus the US, both indexed to 2010, and you see Houston really picking up, seeing more new job advertisements. If you look at changes to total, and this is changes to total job advertisements, so now you have your monthly new job advertisements, and then you got your sum total of all your job advertisements that are out there. If anything, what you see last year is you see a lot of this weight on the bottom half side of that line. Okay, a lot of those bars are on the bottom half of that line. What you're seeing there is slowing down. You're seeing that total job growth really start to get pulled down a little bit by slowdowns in these particular categories. What are these categories? These are occupational categories. What kinds of jobs are actually contributing, are actually being advertised for? What kinds of jobs, what kinds of occupations do employers actually want? This is what it is. This is how it breaks down. And what you're seeing is how the changes in the levels of these particular occupations, say red, very, very important, professional and business services. Professional and business services right here in May 2013 was negative contributor to the total job advertisements. It means we actually lost some advertisement there. Some jobs got filled, and there weren't enough new professional and business related job advertisements to keep that level up, to keep that, to sort of prop that up. And so you see here, we saw a bit of a slowdown, but then at the end of the year, all of a sudden, all of these different categories shot up to the upside. So we saw a little bit of a resurgence. The main things I want to point out from this graph, who are almost always the biggest lines, the biggest movers? Who are the ones that are dominating the swings in demand for labor? Which occupations? It's the professional and related. That's your high certifications, that's your everything from your cardiothoracic surgeons to your accountants and your lawyers and all of your high barrier to entry jobs. Your management, business, and financial is a pretty consistently large one. And then office and sales jobs have been a consistently large one. Office and sales jobs, it's no surprise. We've been probably the best, if not one of the best, commercial real estate markets in the country for over a year. And with all this new office space, you're not surprised if you're seeing a lot of demand for office jobs. Breaking out by industry. So I have here, this is 2013 employment growth by industry. I apologize. We economists do silly things sometimes, not so silly by some definitions, but industry and occupation are two completely different categorizations. So there's a lot of lead over between our categories. But 2013 employment growth revised. Every March, the government revises the prior year's regional employment data. We get better observations, better samples, and so they come out with better data. And we revise it. And what did we do last year? Total 3.4% job growth last year in Houston. As 2013. In 2012, it was 3.6. This year, I'm coming out with a forecast of 3.0. Slowing down. 3.0, still a pretty darn good year. Construction and mining, 5% growth. Leisure and hospitality, 4%. This is our largest category. Trade, transportation, and utilities, that's all your retail, all your wholesale, all of your transportation jobs and trucking and things like that. That area grew very, very strongly for that category. And the main thing I want to point out in construction and mining is a lot of people tend to think that that's all mining, and it's not. 2 years ago, it was all mining. That growth was actually dominated by construction last year, construction jobs. And in point of fact, we have a real problem in our actual supply of skilled tradesmen in construction and manufacturing. And more on that as we move along. I'd also like to point out here, education and health services. This is private market, this is not government, so that is almost all health services. Which is good, because health services had a rough patch after the passage of the Affordable Care Act in terms of employment growth. January. So how did we, now that was how we did over the course of last year. How did we do in January? January, 1.7, our annualized growth rate in January. Probably a little low because, we had a quarter inch of snow, so the whole city shut down for a week. And so that was a problem for us. The construction might have been very strong. Other business services is very strong. Those of you who don't know, other business services might mean auto mechanic. It also might mean a pet hotel. This is just things that we can't quite categorize, so we just call it other services. Sorry, one other point of information here. So financial activities, this is kind of important and sort of a mystery, so please feel free to pipe in if you've got some explanatory power here for this one, because we haven't quite figured it out. Financial activities has had 5 straight months of contraction. They've had a really rough time. And it's pretty broad-based within various financial institutions. Unemployment rate, 5.5% in January for Houston. 5.5% unemployment rate. So despite the stellar job growth, 3.6, 3.4 job growth over the last 2 years, our unemployment rate is still 5.5%. Now that's, compared to the US, that's 6.7, pretty enviable unemployment rate. But remember, unemployment rate is a fraction. There's a denominator there, and that denominator is the labor force. We've been adding lots and lots of employment, but our labor force has been growing almost as fast. So people are they're moving here, or they're deciding to rejoin the labor force because the job prospects are too good. And so they're staying in the market that way. And so our unemployment rate is 5.5%. 6.7% for the US. Again, elected for Houston, the lowest since 2008. However, the opposite situation is true. We've not been creating a lot of jobs at the national level. We've been adding, I think, 170,000 or 175,000 was the average monthly addition for last year. That's not great. That's treading water. Our unemployment rate has fallen because the denominator's gotten smaller. People have left the labor force. And what the research has been steadily confirming over the last 6 months, as we finally start to get really good data that allows us to analyze this stuff, about half of the fall in the unemployment rate at the national level is purely demographic. We're getting older. We're getting older. That's the biggest factor contributing to our fall in unemployment. The flip side of that is that the average age of a college student is getting higher. People are detaching from the labor force and staying in school longer, or they're going back to school at an older age. There's a variety of economic and social reasons why that's happening, but nonetheless, those two factors explain most of the fall in the labor force. It's not been entirely discouraged workers or whatever. It's that there's not a lot we can do from a policy standpoint on the fact that we're getting older. When you look at the metro job growth, was radiating through industries. Anyone care to venture a guess on why I use the term radiating as opposed to just all industries growing? It happened because there was a pattern here, and it's a pattern Houston has seen before. Energy does really well, which feeds into housing and construction, which feeds into everything else. And so there's a pattern, and that same pattern has happened now. 2012, one of the biggest years for employment growth Houston has ever seen. That was predominantly driven by energy. In the first part of the year, transitioning to construction by the beginning of 2012. 2012 was all about construction and manufacturing, feeding into all those feeding off of all that energy. And then we've seen it this year. Over the course of 2013, we saw that transfer into all of our other services. Our retail sales, you look at our retail sales, commercial real estate occupancy is at 90%. Nobody has like 90% occupancy in retail sales. Now, part of that is because of hospitals. Hospitals have been moving into a lot of empty big box stores and a lot of empty places and putting in emergency care facilities and minor care facilities, trying desperately to keep everyone as far away from the emergency room as possible because we don't have enough space. And our emergency rooms for Houston are too far away from most of our people. But nonetheless, radiating through industry. So we've seen this pattern before, and it's happening again. And now we're moving back into more of a normal business cycle. Dallas Fed Research. Texas jobs, adding jobs at all income levels. So there's another story out there that we're adding a lot of jobs in Houston, sure. A handful of high-paying energy jobs. And this is a story that a lot of people like to tell for Texas. A handful of high-paying energy jobs, but the rest of the jobs paints the picture of Texas as a low-wage hellhole of no benefits and no hope. But the data doesn't bear that out. The data tells us actually quite the opposite, that we're growing employment at all income levels, and actually we're growing employment particularly at the higher income levels. But and if you look at the Texas median wage, for the first time in real dollars, the Texas median wage is higher than the national median wage. That's the first time that's ever happened, and that's largely due to energy and the sucking sound of skills as the energy industry looks for people to try and do its jobs. Everything from driving trucks. There are many areas of the state where you don't have enough school bus drivers, because why drive a school bus for that salary when you can make $80,000 to $100,000 a year driving an oil truck? So there's this big sucking sound as the oil industry looks for skills. But income nonetheless growing across all job categories. So why, other than energy, we all know the story about energy. Why did Houston do so well coming out of the Great Recession and during the Great Recession? Does anyone venture a guess? Anyone remember any other factors? No? Okay, I won't put anybody on the spot. Well, here's the thing. What you see on this graph here is home sales, existing home sales in red, per 100,000 payroll employees. I like to do that employee adjustment. You don't see that a lot of other places. I like to do it because Houston population has grown quite a bit, and presumably everyone who's buying a home has a job, because pretty much everyone who buys a home has a mortgage. 2006, 2007, that might not have been exactly true. But presumably you have to have a job to get a mortgage, and everyone who buys a house has a mortgage. So you see this line here. You clearly see the housing boom. You clearly see the housing bust. Anyone venture a guess what those two little spikes were?
Repos.
That's the end of the tax credit.
Yeah.
We tell people, oh, the tax credit's going to go away. I guess I'll go ahead and buy my house now rather than in a few months. So that was a very helpful policy. It got us to substitute when we bought our houses. Didn't actually do anything for how many houses we bought. So we had this big surge, and then we had this lull that came afterwards. Then we see home sales really ticking back up again to about where we were in 2005, 2004. Now, this blue line, these are both indexed here. This blue line here is real median home prices. You can do averages, and it would give you pretty much the same pattern, but real median home prices. The main thing I want you to look at here is what happened from 2002 to 2010. Nothing. It was basically flat. In real dollar terms, for most of the last decade, home prices didn't do anything in Houston and in most of Texas. They kept pace with inflation. That's all they did. Despite this huge run-up in sales. Now what's happening? We have a run-up in sales, but we've seen this huge run-up in prices. You see, in Los Angeles, or in Las Vegas, or many of the losses, many of these other cities, what you had a big boom in demand in 2005. But they were really strict on how much you could build. And so what happens when your, I'm trying to go backwards here, when your demand goes up and your supply is flat, price goes up, and it goes up fast. And that's what happened in most major metros. Houston didn't have that problem. We've got a lot of money, and it's very easy to hook in a new development into our utility grids. And so we had a construction boom. We built a ton of houses in this period here. Now, when the boom ended, all those workmen, many of those workmen, that boom lasted so long. The boom lasted so long and the bust lasted long enough. Many of those workmen left. They moved elsewhere. They switched industries. And now that the construction is coming back, it's costly for them to come back to this industry. So we've actually lost a lot of tradesmen in this industry. But now we are supply constrained. Now we're selling houses that we've got about 2.5 months worth of inventory. We have never had inventory of homes in Houston be this low. We're selling lots of houses. We're building houses as fast as we can, but you have to have a lot to develop a house on. And for a variety of reasons, many of them still having to do with the Dodd-Frank, uncertainty from the Dodd-Frank Act, and uncertainty from the how we're treating banks post-crisis. There are a lot of banks who still just do not want to give a loan to develop land. Want to build a house on a piece of land? Fine. We can finance that deal, that conforms, we're good to go. But Well, we all got into a lot of trouble with land development last time, and the regulators haven't quite clarified how aversely they're going to look at us for going to land loans. So it's a lot harder to get a land loan now. So we have this backlog. The backlog that, according to Metro Study and a couple of other institutions that analyze this, they're telling us another year and a half, 2 years before we can get our supply of lots up to historical norms. Right now we've got about 16 months supply. Anyways, we can talk all, actually there are whole conferences on this topic, but so real estate. The construction real estate jobs, you see total construction here on the left last year, 4.3%. Construction of buildings, 6%. Yes, ma'am?
Can you back up? So if a person was interested in buying a place to live, should they wait?
So the second half of my disclaimer should not be construed to be a recommendation to buy or sell assets or securities. So should you wait? I can't tell you whether or not you should wait because two things are happening. Number one, we're going to have this supply come online in a year or two.
Right.
On the other hand, there is we don't have a clear picture of what population growth is going to do in the interim. Because right now we're keeping pace. We've got a lot of people moving here. We've got a lot of multifamily coming online, but the population growth has been phenomenal. And as long as that population growth stays high, then even if we bring that supply online, that doesn't necessarily mean that the prices are going to fall because the overall demand is going to be higher. We're going to have more people. Also, and I'm not saying anything about the trajectory of interest rates, but generally speaking, when interest rates are at historically low levels, even though they're not as low as they were a few years ago, I wouldn't bank on them staying that way. And so you got to try to figure out: do you think it's going to be more expensive to borrow on a mortgage in 2 or 3 years than it is now?
I do.
There we go.
I guess the problem I'm seeing is that they list houses and then they're over bidding on them.
Well, and I'm an economist, and as long as the two parties come to an agreement, there's no such thing as an overbid in economics parlance. Because we average out people, doesn't that make sense? So we average people that have wildly different preferences. So they're not overbidding. What they're doing is they're saying, all right, well, I have a need for this house, and I'm going to put a bid on it. And right now, the supply is really, really tight. We've got 2.5 months of supply. There are multiple bidders for each house, and so I want to secure that position. Why? Maybe, as was the case for one of the bids on my home last year, maybe I got a job and I need to move to Houston, and I'm in New Mexico, and I don't even need to see the house. I just need to move, and the pictures are fine, and I trust my real estate agent.
Yeah.
Boom, that's it. They're done. Not sight unseen, full price offer.
Yeah, that's kind of scary.
It is kind of scary. What's going to happen when that goes away? Are we going to see a sudden drop in real prices? I don't know. I'd drive a much nicer car if I did.
Matter of fact, it's so insane out there that my neighbor just bought a house, and the builder wouldn't even take a contingency.
Well,
no contingency. You want this house? You pay what I'm asking for it? No contingency.
Yep.
Terrible.
This is the
I
market.
mean, that's the market, yeah.
Now, when the prices were high years ago, was that the same kind of environment? I mean, that's what I'm
We haven't been supply constrained like this ever.
So it's not, there's no duplicate in history.
No, there's no duplicate in history. Well, let me put it in a slightly different economic term. All right, different economic terms. The opportunity cost of living in Houston has never been lower. All right, the opportunity cost. So what you give up in exchange for living in Houston has never been so low. And as a result of that, people respond to incentives. They're moving here. Whether it's for jobs or for job prospects or whatever, they're moving here. And that's going to keep our prices up. And again, 2 years from now, I can't tell you what the balance is between the forces that are going to be pushing up and pushing down on these prices. One thing I can tell you is, like I said, I would make an informed decision on what you think borrowing costs are going to be between now and then, because between now and then, that is probably the most quantifiable thing you can try. at this point, because we don't know what's going to happen as the opportunity cost of moving to Houston rises, as the rest of the national economy improves, as families have alternatives to moving to Houston, as more families have alternatives to moving to Houston, as investors have more alternatives for investment outside of the energy industry. Exactly. What's that going to do? It's going to slow things down for us, for sure. I can't tell you what it's going to do to prices. Anyone else? No worries, no worries. So construction of buildings, and there's no surprise there, with all the commercial real estate, everything going on, say in the Woodlands, for example. This one is a little bit of an anomaly. So this is January to January. And I think this one has as much to do with the weather as anything for the January data. But heavy and civil construction. They had a good year last year. And they're going to have a good year next year. And they're going to have a good year the year after that. And the reason being is that these guys are in dire shortage. Dire shortage. In fact, for many of these types of industries, the only reason for them, and say for many manufacturing jobs, is that they're not hiring more people is because they physically hired everyone who can pass a drug test already. And their specialty trades did well as well. And I'm not joking. I am not joking. Area permits. Permits and housing starts. You see this big boom up. This is a very volatile number, 20-40% moving average year-over-year movements. You see that slowing down, or is it returning to normal? So this is the short run view, and you zoom out, and you see right around here, right around 20, that's kind of normal. Then we have the recession, the 2008 commodity price bubble pops, and here we are coming back down to about normal. Again, I think this is part of that story. We're taking a breath and we're hitting our stride instead of sprinting. So, the 5 pillars. So that's sort of the general economic situation. And there are 5 pillars that I always talk about that I think that frame Houston's economy perfectly, and to some extent do a good job of framing what's happening at the national economy level. All right, anyone care to venture and guess what the 5 pillars of Houston's economy are? Number 1, healthcare. Energy, I'm going to be more specific, I'm going to go with, say, oil and gas extraction. All right. For Houston, unlike most of the country, we can separate energy into oil and gas extraction and refining and petrochemicals. And then the last one, last 2, international trade. And the one that raises eyebrows sometimes, the Johnson Space Center. So oil and gas extraction. Have oil prices been higher than normal of late or lower? They've been higher. On the international market, we've seen oil prices between 100 and 115 bucks now for the better part of 3 years. For the better part of 3 years. Sustained high oil prices. Gas prices, very, very, very low. And let me give you the play-by-play. I apologize, that's a little over here. The play-by-play. So, 2008, commodity price bubble, everybody's really happy. 2009, commodity price bottoms out. And we start seeing a recovery. Prices of oil and gas always been very, very highly correlated, always moved together. They start coming back in 2009 exactly like they normally do. We have this new technology, horizontal fracturing of shale. It's an adaptation of old technologies, but we figured out how to do it. 2004, Barnett, North Texas. Mitchell Energy proved you could do it and make money. We've got all the patents, we figured out how to do it, and we're living in a world. We're still living in a world in early 2010 where natural gas is going to be $8. And then it's going to be $10. And then it's going to be $15 by 2020. This is the world we lived in 2009, 2010. So great! This is this great price. Here we have the Marcellus Shale, this huge ocean of hydrocarbon that we can now get at amongst all these other places that we've got. And we can go get it, and we do. We go after it. And you see here the red line. That's gas regs, gas-directed oil wells. They dive in, and they shoot up, and you see them producing, and all of a sudden people start to realize this is way more productive than we thought it would be. We are producing a lot of natural gas. And so by the middle of 2010, you already start to see the pace of the price recovery in natural gas go away. You see it start to slow down by 2011. And by the middle of 2011, people are starting to realize, wait a minute, we're at $4 natural gas now, $5 natural gas. We're going to start losing money at this pace. We're not making much money in our natural gas, but there's this other thing. that people don't talk about. Natural gas liquids. Natural gas liquids. For those of you who don't know what natural gas liquids are, there's something called ethane, propane, and butane. I'm not requiring you to know much more than that. But ethane, propane, butane. It's this thing that's usually produced with natural gas. Some places have lots of it, some places have very little. But you could drill something called a gas well right here, make all your money on your NGLs, and sure, you'll make a little bit of money on your methane, on your dry gas, the stuff that you burn in your stove, the stuff that heats your house. But whatever, you're just producing that because you want to get at the NGLs. So what happened? We moved out to the Marcellus over here in eastern United States. We doubled down on places like Eagle Ford, on places like the Permian and the Bakken, where we have lots of natural gas liquids. And then by the end of 2011, early 2012, we produced far more than we could consume. Our supply grew much faster than our consumption, our ability to consume. And what happened yet again? We crushed the price. By January of 2012, we had hit historically low real dollar prices for natural gas. By June of 2012, we hit historically low real prices for natural gas liquids. And we hit them again in November of that year. So you see here, now, by mid-2012, you see this red area. By mid-2012, here you see this red area. See here, this is the dry gas. We switched over to wet gas. We doubled down on the Eagle Ford and the related places. And now we're not making any money on anything in these gas wells, and so it bottoms out. That's about as low as it can go without you losing. You got to do some drilling because you lose your contracts, you lose your leases, you lose your people. But nonetheless, that's about as low as it can go. Meanwhile, what's happening? Oil is $100. Oil's $100, and so people respond to incentives. I could drill for oil, which is $100, or I could drill for natural gas, which is $3. It's not, that's not a tough call to make. So people respond to incentives, they move over here, and then it levels out. But even though those rig counts have leveled out, we're getting more and more wells from each rig. All right, so the amount of drilling is actually still increasing, even though the rigs have, and this is a temporary situation. Eventually, we'll sort of max out our productivity gains as we use this technology, and then we'll flatten out, and then the rigs will become the primary thing again. Look at the Williston here. That's the North Dakota. That's the Bakken. You can look at the Permian, Eagle Ford. Continual growth in efficiency. And you can see the story play out here too. Look at the various plays here in the Eagle Ford. Various plays here in Texas. The Barnett, that's North Texas. That's all dry gas. That's methane. Started off real strong. The red area, that's horizontal drilling. It's where you come straight down, turn 90 degrees, and follow the oil along the ground. And you see that falling off. They got a lot of dry gas. Not a lot else going on there. Eagle Ford, you see it tick up, and then you see it flatten out as we move from the wet gas areas from the dry gas areas to the wet gas areas. Now all they're drilling for is oil. We've tripled down on Eagle Ford oil. We've tripled down on oil in the Permian, but the Permian's very different. The Permian, we had all these old vertical wells. Now, vertical wells where you drill straight down, straight into the thing, and you just suck the stuff up. So we had all these old vertical wells, and we fracked. We just went and we were fracking all the old wells. And we did phenomenally well for many, many years. The Permian Basin shale is just getting started, for the most part. This is the bright spot for growth and energy development in the United States this year, is the Permian Basin. For those of you who aren't aware, the blue area down here, the directional, that's where you drill at an angle, you come up to the edge of your property, and you drill under your neighbor's property and take All right, so we've got, so that's what's going on with the energy industry. So no matter what happened in Texas, no matter what happened to the various prices of the various things that we pull out of the ground and sell as energy, there was somewhere in Texas, not too far from Houston, where our people and our patents and our capital could go. And so the full economic impact of all of that activity hit Texas. And the full economic impact of that activity really ramped things up in Houston. However, remember I said we piled into natural gas, killed our economics, piled into natural gas liquids, killed our economics, piled into oil. We're trying to kill our economics. We haven't figured out how to do it yet. We've dramatically increased our production, but we've got these bottlenecks. We don't have quite the right pipeline capacity, quite the right storage capacity in quite the right places. And so these bottlenecks are causing problems. So if you can't get all the oil out of a place, that means that in that place you've got a surplus. And surplus is pushed down on prices. And so WTI, which should be trading at, say, $108, $109 right now, Historically, that's about where it would be if it was trading normally, because it would trade about the same price as Brent. Now it's trading at about $8 less. There are days when it's trading, when the bottlenecks were really, really bad, where you had as much as an $18, $20 price difference because the bottlenecks were so bad. And that's just from Oklahoma to the world market. Between the Permian Basin and West Texas and Oklahoma, there were further discounts because of further bottlenecks. Now, manufacturing, I've already said here, labor everywhere, and an area of skill to hire. I could talk about bottlenecks all day, and there are endpoint of fact conferences on bottlenecks. But I would like you to focus your eyes on this part of the map of our shale resources in 2011. There's more color in this map now, it's a little bit dated, but focus your eyes here. And with your peripheral vision, to sort of drive home the point on bottlenecks, with your peripheral vision looking here, I want you to focus on what happens to the color on the map when I switch from a map of where all of our shale is to a map of where our pipelines are.
Yep.
This is why we're starting to worry about how fast trains loaded with oil drive. This is why we're worried about pipelines and hearing all this debate about pipelines coming in and out of, coming through North Dakota, coming down to the U.S., because we don't have the capacity to move this stuff, and we've really got to build it. We're building out as fast as we can. But there are still benchmarks. Even there are still problems of getting everything built. Even here, from getting the oil out of West Texas, we didn't have enough capacity. We had to add several pipelines since this map was made from West Texas to the Gulf Coast directly to alleviate the pressure. A pipeline between West Texas and Oklahoma, where WTI is priced, goes down for a day, and the price of oil in West Texas drops $15 because we're completely capacity constrained. There's no excess capacity in the system. We are operating at 100% operable capacity, or almost 100%. Even here in West, you can hardly even see the ground in this part of the country here, where most of our country's refining capacity is, where most of our chemical capacity is. You can hardly even see the ground, and oil here is trading at a discount to oil here because we don't have enough stuff, and we don't know where we're going to get the people to build it. We're having a real shortage. You know, there's a saying that the amount of, that I've been going around with because I think it's funny, but the amount of colored hair at any of these trade conferences has more to do with the price of hair dye than it does with the age of the people who are there. Which I guess makes it more fun to economists. But anyways, the only reason to see color, anyways. So you're moving forward here. Where are all these manufacturing people? So how did manufacturing do last year? 2013. Non-durable goods, all right, that's your grains and other food, spirits. We did pretty well. Houston, for some reason, we had a really big increase in our exports of spirits and alcoholic beverages. The durable goods, and this is the breakout of durable goods. All right, petroleum and coal, very small group. Chemical, this is huge. I'll go into that in just a second here. Fabricated metal products did very well. Machinery did very well. Other machinery, I counted up here. Other machinery are miscellaneous engines and motors and pumps and valves. Agricultural, construction, and mining. That's pretty much all mining. That's a subsector of machinery there. Here's the main one I like to focus on, chemical. If you had looked at chemical employment in the United States, or in Texas, or in Houston, for anything larger than the last 3 to 4 years, this is the line you would have seen. You'd have seen it up here, and you'd seen it do this. And we added a new factory, and then the employment went back down. You see chemical employment steadily dropping. The reason for this is because natural gas is expensive, and our chemical infrastructure is tied to the price of natural gas. Because of when we developed and the economics that we had, the incentives that we had, our chemical industry developed to utilize natural gas liquids. The rest of the world developed later. They had different incentives. They developed to use a byproduct of oil called naphtha. Okay? The chemical industry said, you know what, United States, you're dead to us. We are going to invest in you when EPA forces us to. We will invest in you when population growth says we need a little bit more domestic production, but otherwise, you're dead to us. All of the opportunity for growth and return and rate of return on our investment is in the Middle East, and it's in Asia. And a little bit in South America, but Middle East and Asia, particularly Asia. And so that's where all the dollars are going. Then shale happened. And now, for the first time in these last 2 years, you're seeing chemical manufacturing tick up. You're seeing a huge premium being paid for chemical engineers, or for anyone in professional chemical anything, because we haven't been producing any of these people in a long time, because we thought there wasn't going to be any demand for them here. And so it's a huge reversal of fortune that chemical manufacturing is ticking up. There is literally billions of dollars of capital investment coming to the Gulf Coast between now and 2020. If everything that's been announced gets built, it's as much as a 50% increase in our existing capacity to produce chemicals. We're already the largest chemical producer for petrochemicals. And this is plastics, this is polyethylene, this is the stuff in your pockets and on your person right now. The stuff lining that cup that's full of water right there. It's a huge deal. Literally, if you count all of the investment coming to the Gulf Coast, not just petrochemicals, but upgrades to our refineries, because our refineries, they thought we were going to be living in a heavy sour crude. They thought we were going to be living in a world with lots of heavy sour. We weren't going to be producing much crude oil here, and so they made investments assuming that we weren't going to have any light sweet crude. And that light sweet crude was going to be really expensive. Then shale happened. And everything coming out of shale is light. And our refiners don't really want it, because that would require a huge capital expense to actually be able to refine light sweet oils. And so there's a big emphasis now to try to get this stuff exported. But how have refiners been doing? WTI discount. So oil, I've been telling you about that bottleneck, WTI is discounted. Our oil is cheaper than their oil. Let's just start with that. Cheap natural gas. Our natural gas is cheaper than their natural gas. Our natural gas liquids are cheaper than their natural gas liquids. From a refiner's perspective, that's heat and that's electricity. So oil, heat, electricity, that's almost your entire feed slate. That's almost your entire cost basis. We are now the low-cost producer, or nearly the low-cost producer globally for many of these refined petroleum and chemical products, and we are exporting as a result of that. So their margins have been anywhere from about 20 to 30% above historical norms. That's not saying anything about total returns, it's just saying their margins. 20 to 30% above historical norms, so they've been doing well. Cheap NGLs, I've told you already about ethylene, about petrochemicals, and about how the shale revolution is impacting that. Cost advantage and soft domestic consumption at the end of the Great Recession has really boosted exports. Organic chemicals have been a huge component of growth in exports from the Texas Gulf Coast over the last few years. Also, I'll see nothing here. Finished petroleum products. We are now a net exporter of energy, particularly diesel, because diesel fuel is what the emerging economies use, and diesel fuel, and the emerging economies are responsible for 100% of the growth in energy consumption over the last decade. No energy consumption growth in the US, none in Europe, and none forecasted in the foreseeable future. All of our increases in demand for energy are expected to be offset by efficiency gains. So if you're in the energy industry, who do you want to sell to? You want to sell to the emerging world, because that's where the demand growth is coming. What do they want? They want diesel and chemicals. What are we producing? Diesel and chemicals. Slight hitch, you don't get much diesel from shale gas. From shale oil, I mean. Your yields are lower, so you want something heavier than what we're producing. Moving on. International trade. Yes, sir.
You may have said this, I don't remember, but what do you foresee the price of oil year 2, 3 out? At about 100?
It's hard to say. I'll tell you this. Number one, the incremental production growth in the United States and Canada is about equal to the forecast, to the expected consumption growth between now over the next 2 years. Okay. So what that's telling us, is that basically we're not expecting any major changes in the amount of excess capacity. Okay, excess capacity is key, because what happens to your, here's your demand line. Here's your demand line. As you get close to excess capacity, to your capacity limits, your supply curve goes vertical. When your supply curve goes vertical, it takes very little change in demand to cause a huge swing in price. All right. And so if you have the more excess capacity you have, the further out that is. We have very little excess capacity. Libya accounts for Libyan production, for example, potential production accounts for half of our total excess capacity. That's why people freaked out when Libya started having its Arab Spring. So there's not going to be a lot of change in excess capacity. So I can't say whether our prices are going to be higher or lower. What I can say is that I'll say two things. Number one, our supply-demand balance is not likely to change much. All right, so you can think of that as being relatively flat. So your other factors are your geopolitical side and your cost side. On your cost side, your marginal well, your least profitable well, breaks even around 75 to 80 bucks. In economics parlance, what that means is that the price, the mean price, the price to which you should expect oil to gravitate, plus or minus geopolitical and short-term shocks to supply and demand and blah, 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 is around 75, 80 bucks. That's not saying that that's what the price is going to be, but economic theory says that that's sort of your gravitation point going forward. That's where it's going to try to go to if you were to remove all of the geopolitical and temporary shocks to supply and demand globally, which is a very long-winded way of saying I don't know. Yes?
A few years ago, say we buy the cost of oil, investors, I think they were buying futures or something like that.
In trading futures, yeah.
Is that still see that, or did they do something to regulate that so they can do it?
No, there's this thing here, you don't have to have much skin in the game to put a bet on futures. And so there was this thought that, oh, well, they're just pushing up the price of oil for whatever reason. And you really don't want to put the kibosh on that, because it goes both ways, and people only complain about it when they push the price of oil up. They don't complain about it when they push the price of oil down. And there's no evidence that any of the regulatory framework that they proposed really wouldn't have mattered for it might have mattered for volatility, but it wouldn't have affected the mean price much. Price still would have gone up a lot. It just would have been less volatile, perhaps, with some of the rules. And so there hasn't been much change in the regulation. And yeah, so we can talk more about that after. I don't know how to do it on time. I'm probably running over. So international trade, next big industry. Real export growth last year from the Houston Gallatin Customs Districts, which is almost all of the trade on the Texas Gulf Coast, negative 2.9%, meaning exports contracted last year in 2013 compared to 2012. If you exclude our increasing exports of gasoline and diesel and propane and all of that, that number is actually 1.6% lower. So actually, exports contracted by about 4.5%. On the import side, imports negative, and that's mostly because of oil imports. So here's the line, year-over-year growth, moving average. The blue line here, imports, sharply negative. Why? We don't import any more oil to the Texas Gulf Coast. We're not importing any more oil. Let me rephrase that. We're not importing any more light sweet oil, which is similar to the shale oil that we're producing. We're still importing all the heavy sour stuff from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia that we always were. We're trying to get more Canadian oil, but we're not importing it through the port. Exports also have been slightly negative. The global economy has been slowing. The emerging economies have been driving energy demand, which drives our total export growth in this region. They've been slowing down. They were really the thing popping up global GDP growth the several years after the Great Recession. They are the ones propping that up. You saw global trade go from 5.5% growth to 2% growth in 2 years. This year, they're thinking maybe 3%, 3.5%. We'll see how it all shakes out. But nonetheless, you hear a lot of, no one talks about the BRICS anymore. Brazil, not a great outlook. China, their outlook becoming more uncertain or less uncertain, depending on which news headline you happen to read that day. But nonetheless, there's certainly a softening in the emerging economies, and they're prop to global trade growth. And that affects us here, because we are plugged, one of the things that helped us in the Great Recession, we talk about energy, but the energy industry wouldn't matter so much if we were not plugged into the global economy. The global economy is where the story is. These are the major trade partners that we have. Mexico had a tough year last year, and that was part of it. Mexico had a disappointing year in terms of GDP growth. They're actually looking very good this year, and they are by far our largest trading partner, even out of the Port of Houston. Brazil did okay. Venezuela has just been wildly fluctuating, but Chile had a bad year as well. China buying our plastics. We make all the PVC and polymers that go into all of their buildings and their civil construction projects. They're buying other things as well, but particularly when China turns on and off the credit spigot, that's what happens. You can pretty much chart what happens to the flows of plastics from us to them, because they cannot compete with our prices.
Are we still exporting a lot of liquid natural gas to China?
We've never exported a lot of liquid natural gas to anyone, but we are exporting some to Asia. Really what they're looking for is Japan. That's where everything's going for, because Japan has not yet gotten over its anti-nuclear stance. And so until they bring some of that nuclear plants back online, they're paying $15 for natural gas. $16. It's terribly expensive. It's been great for us because of that, a lot of their competitors, a lot of the chemical and manufacturing industries that competed with us are now completely competitive. But it's been a tough time for them because of that. LNG exports are probably like meaningful LNG exports. The proposed up to 5 BCF a day or whatever it is of exports of LNG, assuming that ever actually gets that high. That's a couple of years away. It's going to take a while to build it and permit it and all that other stuff. Real estate moving forward, higher and rebounded. So Texas Medical Center. High concentration of human capital, I'll get back to that in a second. Uncertainty from the Affordable Care Act. Here's the graph that paints the picture. So this is the two main categories of health employment: ambulatory and medical, and hospitals. Hospitals were already having a tough time from the Great Recession. And you saw their employment growth rate fall. They're still growing employment, but if you saw it fall, basically this line here moves with this length of the line outside the door. There's a population growth that they have to meet, and if the line outside gets too long, they're hiring somebody, but they're not really interested in doing much else. Ambulatory medical care, pretty much to the day. This is the larger category. Almost to the month, March 2010, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, they started hiring fewer people. Their hiring rate fell and fell and fell, as it became clear that this was a really behemoth piece of legislation. I'm going to give credit where credit is due. They've written 70% of the rules for the Affordable Care Act have now been written, and they are zeroing in on about 250,000 pages of new legislation by the time the rules are finished being written. And so that big behemoth stack of uncertainty, as far as not knowing what the rules are, really cut down employment growth. What happened here? Why did employment growth start ticking back up? Houston attained its prior peak level of employment. Private employment means private health insurance. Private health insurance means profit and margin for hospitals. The other reason is that the stock market had bounced back. Stock market bounced back. Your endowments become flush. You can start issuing grants for research again. And so all of this sort of feeds into it, and you start seeing the health industry come back, and many mothballed construction projects and real estate projects move forward. Johnson Space Center. Again, high concentration of human capital, billions of dollars in government contract money. Most of that spent in Texas, most in Southeast Texas, most in our part of Texas. The commitment to the Johnson Space Center was extended to 2024. That's good for us because the commitment to the International Space Station extended. That's good for us because that's what we do at the Johnson Space Center, is human performance and human performance in space in particular. That's really, really good for us. You look at the budget. We've had budget losses each year, and right now they're banking on this about $4.5 billion for NASA for the next year. About $4.5 billion started at Johnson Space Center, as $17.5 billion for NASA. There's a competing bill now, so it might be plus or minus. They're thinking they're pretty sure they're going to get this amount of money. Any job losses that have occurred? There haven't been many, but there's not really much worry about job losses at Johnson Space Center. Even if we did lose some of those people, the energy industry has already tried to hire them anyways because they need those skills. So you might see people move from Clear Lake to Woodlands, but beyond that, the Johnson Space Center is pretty safe. They lost about 2,000 jobs for closing the Space Shuttle program. Closing the Space Shuttle program. So they went from being the 4th largest to the 7th largest employer in the region, which is why we focus on them so much. Now, also, I just want to give kudos to NASA for recently contributing to a major discovery in astrophysics. But anyway, so NASA, they're looking okay. They really want their budget to grow some more. They might even get a new building in the next few years. I just got word which is great because the last time they got a new building, we were working on going to the moon. Sorry, I'm going too fast there. So I've now said 2 or 3 times here, high concentration of human capital. I focused earlier on the wage distribution of the jobs that we were growing. And so now I'm going to sort of drive home the punchlines, especially since y'all are tied to the education industry. Why do I keep concentrating on high human capital, high skills? And that's because there's been a lot of, this is my personal story that I like to tell here, as far as the research goes. There's a lot of talk about growth and income inequality in the United States. The top tiers, top percentiles by wage growth have been doing this. The bottom have more or less been doing this, been flat. And what I'm here to tell you is that that picture, up and flat, is a little bit of a lie. If you take those people out, and instead of dividing them by where they happen to fall on the wage distribution that year, you divide them according to their level of skill attainment. Whether it's years of education, you can talk about certifications as far as the type of industry they're in. You get a very different picture, one that's a little bit more sobering. One where real wages for the skilled have been growing, for the unskilled have been contracting for the last 40 years. If you forgive a little bit of averaging, all of the real growth in income in the United States over the last 40 years accrued to the skilled. It accrued to the PhD researchers, the cardiothoracic surgeons, the chemical engineers, the petroleum engineers, the sonographers, the dentists, the tradesmen, who are all in increasingly short supply. If your skill could be replaced by a computer, it has been, or it's going to be. To the extent that it can't, you're okay, and your wages have largely been rising. If your job can be exported, you are competing with a global marketplace for labor now, for low-skilled jobs. Technology and globalization have really driven down the value of what low-skilled individuals are capable of producing. And that's why their wages went down. So, we talk about high skills. And again, whether you're talking about a guy with a GED and is a certified machinist, or you're talking about somebody with a master's degree in chemical engineering, that's where the returns are. And if you want to know what's happening in your community in terms of the trajectory of its economy, what type of growth it's likely to have, you need to focus on your development and of a pipeline of these skilled professions, because that's where the growth is. Overall, look at the outlook. So, I like that picture. So look at the outlook for Texas. Our outlook's pretty darn good. This is a map of our shale all around the world. The gray areas are areas that have not been assessed. The white areas are areas that have been assessed. The yellow, we know there's shale there. We don't know what's in it. And the red, we have an idea of what's in it. All right? Most of the world has not been surveyed. But what is clear is that everyone who has ever produced commercial oil or natural gas of any kind has shale, and many places that have never produced commercial oil or natural gas of any kind also have shale. So I apologize if you are someone who is a very passionate environmentalist, but you are not going to get any relief from the onslaught of hydrocarbon. Peak hydrocarbon has been pushed into the distant future. Even if we don't develop any of the rest of this stuff, this growth in production from shale in the U.S. isn't supposed to peak until about 2025, 2030. Assuming we don't improve our technology any more than we already have. I wouldn't make that bet. So we've got a lot of places for our people and our patents to go once our productivity, once our domestic resources have matured and are developing at sort of a normal clip. We're not surviving the gold rush. And every oil rig on the planet already has a patent, or some type of consulting fee tied back to Houston. So our outlook is pretty good, particularly from this new resource shock that we've had. Uncertainties persist. Regulatory policy, of course, the Affordable Care Act, not completely written. The Dodd-Frank Act, not completely written. What's the environmental regulations going to be? Are we going to get new pipelines? What are the labor regulations going to look like? The global economy has been slowing. That's more pertinent for us than for maybe some other parts of Texas, other parts of the country, because of our major port that we sit on. We are plugged into the global economy. Texas jobs outlook 2.4%, plus or minus 0.5%. That's probably going to come up as we get out of the winter doldrums, because there's ample evidence in the Beige Book and other annual reports that the winter really did put down pressure on our numbers. And so you're probably going to see our forecast pop back up here in the next couple months. Houston job outlook, dropped 3%. We're at about, that number's a little old now, so that's 2.8% GDP growth for the US for this year. And we think that's really got by because of the recovery in the housing industry, because of the recovery in household finances. Household finances are better than they've looked in 15, 20 years. So I'm standing between you and lunch, but I'd be happy to take any further comments, questions, or aspersions you'd like to get off your chest.
You talked about interest rates, changing out. Anything in particular with government issues, securities, or volatility, or increasing those?
Well, first off, as much as I enjoy studying economics, I'm not interested in experimenting with being unemployed. So I'm not going to say anything about the interest rates specifically. What I will say, we already saw sort of an outsized response to Janet Yellen's press conference yesterday. The notion that we would, the uncharacteristically precise moment where she said 6 months after we end quantitative easing, we might raise interest rates. And don't hold her to that. She's not going to. All of the above is subject to change. The response to that, we already saw a 10 basis point increase in the interest rates on Treasury yields. 10 basis point increase in Treasury yields. So, what is the market response going to be? Is that going to be maintained? Is that going to go away over the next couple of weeks? I don't know. What I will say is that as far as interest rates goes, what we might need to worry about. I don't know of anything that might cause this, all right? But if interest rates were to spike for treasuries for some reason, we don't know why, there's nothing at all that we can think of that might make that happen. Then we would have certainly fiscal problems, and that fiscal problems would translate into the real economy in the short run. So in the short run, that would take government spending out of the GDP equation, and that would certainly be a headwind to the economy. But there's nothing that indicates that anything like that is about to happen. If anything, the opposite is true. As we ease off of quantitative easing, as we pull back on the amount of accommodation that we're putting into the economy, what we're seeing capital flows readjust back towards the United States. So we're seeing firms that have said, all right, interest rates are really low, we're not getting much yield, so we're going to rotate some of our assets out so we get an optimal portfolio mix. We're going to rotate some of our assets into emerging economies, financial instruments in emerging economies. We're going to rotate them into other types of assets, maybe some riskier assets, and say, all right, we're going to try to maintain a certain amount of yield. And now, as we're pulling back on accommodation, you're seeing some of those funds come back the other way. And so, while you might think less Federal Reserve buying would push up on interest rates, Treasury yields, this converse behavior by the market, which, by the way, it's a much larger movement of resources than what the Fed's actually been buying, is pushing the other way. I don't know what the balance is going to be going forward. I could not predict that, and as I've said many times, I would drive a much better car if I could tell you what that balance would be. The other thing is that, aside from the action of the Fed and sort of the implicit subsidy sort of confidence in the U.S. because the Fed reduces its accommodation and says, well, the only reason the Fed's doing that is because they feel like the economy is doing very well. All right, well, there's that. There's a safe haven effect. Despite many of the protestations to the contrary of many media outlets, we are still, by and large, the linchpin of the global economy. And anything that could take the United States economy to a very bad place, generally, would make things far worse for most of the world. And so we are subsidized by what President Fisher has called being the best looking horse in the glue factory. And that if things look uncertain, if things look bad for the global GDP growth, we're still a safe haven. We're still a port against the storm of volatility that you would see, particularly in emerging economies.
Thanks.
All right. Yes, sir.
Is there potential benefit to the U.S. as a result of Russia and the European Union's geopolitical?
Yes.
Will we see increased energy exports to offset Russia? No.
We can't, even if we wanted to, we don't have the capacity to move that much LNG to Europe to make a difference. We don't have the capacity, even if we wanted to. And it's not quite clear what, or let me rephrase that. It's becoming clear, it's never been an issue before, that if I have a contract with a company or a country to deliver LNG, that based on a permit the federal government giving me, the EIA says, well, no, we can revoke that permit if it's in the net public interest. The public interest has always been, now the public interest presumably is to prevent price spikes in the United States. But this is sort of new, this has sort of never been a problem before, so we don't know to what extent they're going to say, well, it's in the public interest to always have very low prices. And so let's block that. But most of these LNG facilities, all of the LNG that they are capable of moving is already locked up in contract. And so it would be legally problematic to do that. But we still don't have the capacity to make that much of a difference. Oil, it's still illegal to export oil from the United States. It's illegal to export oil, and we've got the Jones Act, which says it has to fly on a U.S. flagship, and there just aren't, even to move it around the country, and there just aren't that many ships capable of doing it. There's a number of things that are de facto impossible for us to export oil. Oil is not really, the thing that really, from a geopolitical standpoint, the thing that we could really benefit the most from is counterbalancing Russia's over-concern over what might happen to aquifers in Germany and France if they start fracking. And that's my sort of personal joke. Russia's very concerned about environmental issues in Germany and France because if they start fracking, all of a sudden Russia loses its monopoly on supplying natural gas to Europe. That worries them because that's all they've got. And their economy is already very, very sensitive. Like I said, no one talks about the BRICS anymore. Russia, there's no R in BRIC. It's not going to be technically. But now it's MIST, I think is the new acronym of the visual. Certainly the whole, I don't see much short-term energy policy from the U.S. that's going to make any impact on, there are other things we can do. All right. Thank you. Presentation will be available to everyone, including the extra slides that you didn't get to see.
All right, it is a large file, so we're going to post it on our web, and you're going to be able to download it because it's huge. That's why we didn't have the copies for you to do other graphics and stuff. Continue, and please, there's water, coffee, and in order to stay on track, we're a few minutes, a little bit over. We'll adjust the CPE credits, of course, but we're going to stay on track. A couple of presentations still coming up, so they're really, really good presenters. So this next one is by John King. He's been here with us several times. We had a number of topics that he didn't quite cover last time he was here. One that I wanted to ask him to do was this real estate issues. And a lot of times, CFOs will get counter transaction questions so that it's important to us if you're going to acquire a property or sell a property, and so he can explain a little bit more as we move forward with that. So glad the time is here, John, and so please help me welcome John King.
Hello, good morning still. Good to be here again. We're going to talk about real estate issues for the next hour or so. This is a topic. What we're going to talk about is both the issue of the sale of land, which sounds like now from the last presentation that if you're holding some real estate you're going to sell, you're sitting on a gold mine. Almost sounds like. And then we're also going to talk about acquisition, about eminent domain and condemnation issues, and just go over that briefly. But so starting with the sale of land. I don't, I've handled a number of transactions where districts have needed to sell land. If they're transitioning, they're swapping between, wanting to move from one location to another, don't feel like they're going to need the property that they're currently located at, the buildings, facilities, and go ahead and sell that. And so that's the basis of that. I mean, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the main point is, of course, that's one of the quintessential issues of board authority is to hold land for the benefit of the district and to be able to sell and acquire property. And, I guess the main point about it is that the sale of land is really generally done as another competitive bid process. And we'll go through the statutes that apply to that, but it's just basically a competitive bid process to sell land. Acquiring land can either be done through a negotiation process or through the condemnation statutes, the eminent domain statutes. But the general rules on just selling land, the overview of it is that the Education Code says that the board can authorize the sale of property other than minerals. There's a separate section on minerals, held in trust for public school purposes, that the president executes a deed to the purchaser, citing the resolution of the board. And power here. That the district, the statute specifically says may employ, retain, contract with, or compensate a licensed real estate broker. So that question, that's specifically in the statute. It just mentions that you can hire a broker. The recommended steps for the sale of real property would be that you would have the board meeting to approve the advertising and for sale, and to delegate to the administration the authority to open and evaluate bids. So in other words, the board says, okay, we generally want to talk about selling land, so we're going to approve to advertise or issue a bid to obtain quotes for selling the property. The next step, or you can do it before that, would be to prepare the bid specifications. The properties advertised in the newspaper will go over the requirements for that for public sale by sealed bids with detailed bid specifications. You'd state the deadline to receive bids. The sealed bids are opened and evaluated, again, like a normal bidding process. Then you would have a board meeting where the board would approve the award of the bid to the successful bidder and approve a resolution authorizing the sale. And an earnest money contract is executed with the successful bidder. Well, one thing I was going to mention about the earnest money contract is that when we've done these sales in Laredo, of course I'm from Laredo, Texas, and that economy is such that when we wanted to sell specific properties, we've done it in a way that we have, I'm figuring out how to explain this, but there's two different ways you can do it. You can issue your bid specifications and say, look, we're going to require our bidders to submit a check for the full amount. You can say, you're going to pay us a money order or a certified check. You're going to give us a check for the full amount. And when you give us the check for the full amount, the person who gives us the check for the most money wins. The way we needed to do it in Laredo, as of course kind of a necessity, is that we require a 10%, a check for the 10%, it can be any amount, but what we do is we request a check for 10% of the bid amount, which is your earnest money, and we execute an earnest money contract, because for us, in our situation, normally the bidders will need to go get financing, for example. And so we might allow them in an earnest money contract to say, okay, we're going to allow you to go get financing, but that, again, in your economy, you may not be in a situation where you need to allow people to go get financing. You can say, hey, you need to give us a check for the full amount up front if that's not a concern. If you believe like your economics of it will allow you to just tell the bidders, you just give us the checks for the full amount up front, we hold those checks, and the successful bidder will keep your check, and the non-successful bidders, we return your checks to you, and that's it. We have, and we'll get into this in more detail, but we do require in our bid specifications, we tell them that if you give us that check, and you're the successful bid, not for the non-successful bidders, but for the successful bidders, if the contract's awarded to you, you say, oh, that you're not going to go through the deal because whether or not you can get financing or whatever other situation, we've had some weird circumstances come up with the sale of property, that you tell them it's non-refundable, that you've lost, and again, kind of maybe a typical earnest money situation, but you tell them that if you give us that deposit for your earnest money and for whatever reason you do not consummate the deal, you've lost that money. And the justification for it is, if you ever need to talk about this, because people talk, well, is that fair? Is it equitable for them to lose their money if you didn't go through with the sale of the property to them? The answer to that is, when you all are incurring your internal costs and expenses, your administrative time and effort to do that, and And the earnest money is supposed to, the idea is it would compensate you for the time and effort that you invested in that, going through the bidding, the advertising process and all that. And so it's a way for you to get back your expenses even if you don't go through with the transaction at that time. Okay, so then you would schedule a date for the closing to take place on the sale of the property. I guess again, one of the ideas is you should keep in mind what the process is for the sale of property. That it's not just on the, you wouldn't just say, well, the day the board approves, you have your board meeting, the board says, yes, we approve the sale of the property to the highest bidder. We're going to award the bid to this higher bidder. The sale isn't really, it's not consummated that night because there are things, well, for example, your buyer may want to go get title insurance. And so if your buyer wants to get title insurance to have a title policy for their purchase of the property, they're going to want to go through a closing process. And so you can plan that in your bid specifications to set a date to allow them to get the title policy issued and go through a title company. And again, you'd say, well, it's no cost to us, bidder. If you want to do that, you can incur that cost, but we're not going to pay for it. I mean, the bid specifications would normally provide that the district is not going to incur any cost with the sale of the property. Okay, so the sample language for an initial agenda item, discussion of possible action to authorize administration to issue a request for sealed bids on the sale of real property, including authorizing the superintendent or designee to open and evaluate the sealed bids to recommend the successful bidder to the board of trustees. The bid specifications, this is where, of course, you want to put in whatever detail you want. There's different situations we've encountered where we think, gee, we wish the bid specifications had addressed some of these issues, but you would, those of you who heard presentations from me before about bids and the information in there, you want to have a copy of your contract in there, your earnest money contract, and the deed that the successful bidder will be required to execute. You put those documents in your bid specification. If they don't, well, number one, if they don't object to them and they've accepted your language when they submit their responses to the bid. Number two, if they do respond with exceptions to your language, you don't necessarily have to accept it, obviously, because the main consideration you're going to be taking into account is your highest bidder dollar amount. But if they come back and say, well, we don't like this language in your deed, or we don't like this language in your earnest money contract, I mean, you probably have the leverage to be able to ignore that, but it does, they can notify you if they want to make some changes to the language. But if they don't, then that you're at least establishing these are the documents we're going to use. You obviously would want to state the minimum bid amount that will be accepted for sale of the property. You want to require, as I was talking about, at least a non-refundable earnest money deposit or full payment up front if that's the way you want to do the bid. You address what happens if the highest bidder withdraws or is disqualified. Again, we've just over the years ended up with kind of weird situations where we would have a person who responds to the bid, for example, and then they're the highest bidder, and we say, okay, we're going to award the contract to you, but we do it with an earnest money contract, and then that bidder goes to get financing for it, and they didn't qualify for financing. So then they come back and say, oh, can my daughter, can you include a family member as the name of the buyer, or the grantee of the deed? Can you include my child or somebody else in there? And you deal with questions about, well, but they weren't the person who bid on it. You could have the other bidders complain that you're including other parties in the transaction. So we've ended up with different kind of weird scenarios, but we've ended up where the bidder has said, the high bidder has said, oh no, never mind, I'm not going to do it. So okay, we're going to keep your check, and then but you do need to provide in there what's going to happen if you go down to number two, and then it's kind of the typical thing. It's the equivalent of negotiating with the highest ranked bidder and going down to number two. But you do want to address that in your bid specification. You want to specify that you're selling the property as is with the buyer responsible for inspection and testing. And there's legal language your attorney would provide for you, but there's you're disclaiming anything on the property. You're saying, hey, this property has any contamination. I don't know what kind of old properties or different issues you all might have with your pieces of real estate here, but if it's a building or something, you don't want to you're not taking any responsibility. If it's an older building and it has lead paint or something, you're just saying, look, buyer, you're responsible for doing your inspections before you submit your bid. You're responsible for doing any testing you want to do, because otherwise you're taking the building as is without any representations regarding the condition of the property. Just a reminder that the sale is not final until the board approves it. We actually include this language in the bid specifications because a lot of buyers don't understand that. They think if you notify them when you submitted the highest bid, they think, okay, I won, it's done. And they need to understand that the sale is not final until board action is taken on it. They're just, you all may deal with those same situations with other bidding vendors. Okay, so here are the requirements. The primary statute that applies to the sale of property is this Local Government Code Section 272-001. You have to publish in the newspaper, again, kind of typical bidding requirements of a newspaper of general circulation in the county in which the land is located. The notice must include a description of the land, including its location, and a procedure by which the sealed bids to purchase the land may be submitted. So you do have to state what your procedures are. Again, kind of typical bidding, advertisement or publication. Oh, I'm having technical difficulties here. The notice must be published on 2 separate dates. This is specified in the statute. And the sale or exchange may not be made until after the 14th day after the date of the second publication. So it doesn't specify, you just have to publish it on 2 separate dates. Those dates might be 2 days apart or a week apart, but then you can't finalize or open to the date of the second, the sale or exchange may not be made until after the 14th day. That's a little confusing because it doesn't say, what I was trying to read in there was that it doesn't say that you can't open the bids until after the 14th day. It just says the sale or exchange can't be until after the 14th day of the date of the second publication. I don't know if it's going to happen that fast anyway because you have to have a board meeting, but that's a specific waiting period that you have to have that's provided by statute. Okay, so I've said here that the general rule is that you have to have competitive bidding to sell property, that you're going to sell the highest bidder. There are exceptions to that. That's the general rule, but by statute, there are exceptions to that. So, for example, this is my categorization of this is narrow strips of land. So that's number one. But the more detailed description of that is land that because of its shape or lacks access or it's a small area can't be used independently under its current zoning or under applicable subdivision or other development control ordinances. So if you have these narrow strips of land, you don't necessarily have to competitively bid it. And they'll start to make sense when you get the sense of the categories. Streets or alleys owned outright or used by easement. And by the way, this statute that we're talking about here, local government code, of course, it's not the education code, it's not specific to school districts. So if you're saying, well, why is some of this language in here? It's because this applies to local governments, entities other than school districts, municipalities and counties. But so there's this other one that land that was originally acquired for streets, rights of ways, or easements. The political subdivision chooses to exchange. But we actually in Laredo have dealt with this one because we do have property that was originally acquired. And we have a situation where historically in Laredo with our older school district, Laredo ISD, as opposed to our younger school district, United ISD, where we were once we were a municipal school district, and then back in the 1950s, by statute, the municipal school district split off into independent school districts. But so we had a lot of our properties where our schools were on property that was, if you had a 4-city block area, you had the streets in between it, but on the plats, the city plats were shown as city streets. And so we had to go through a process of acquiring those or selling them. If we were going to sell like a street that ran along the side of a school or through the middle of it or something, we were dealing with this issue that was originally acquired for streets or right-of-ways. But there is the rule that in certain areas, and again, it kind of depends on your particular municipality and how things are done. The rule in a city is that when you're on a street, you actually technically own the land that goes to the middle of your street, even though it's being used as the right-of-way or the street. And so that could be an issue with when you're trying to sell your property that has the street in front of it. But these are the, and again, these are the exceptions, but they're fairly limited. If you're going to have property developed with contract with an independent foundation, I don't know, I haven't had that situation come up, but this is the one where this, I've also dealt with this one before, real property interest conveyed to a governmental entity that has the power of eminent domain. So if you're going to exchange, if you're going to sell property or exchange property, say with the city, you're like, hey, we want some property over here that you own, and or the city comes in, you want to sell a school or something. We'll talk about some exceptions, particularly for a campus. But if you wanted to sell property, you have the city or the county that might be interested in buying it. You don't necessarily have to competitively procure it. So, and that's one that may come up more often when you're trying to do deals, because a lot of times, you know, an available buyer might be another local governmental entity. So that one does come into play more often. And then there's two other categories that completely just never will apply to school districts. So I'm just telling you, there's two other ones, but we're not going to go over it. Okay. These other ones that we talked about, the ones we just covered, these narrow strips of streets or alleys, that list of 5 properties. This is another exception to the bidding requirements. So these other interests that we just reviewed may be sold to an abutting property owner in the same subdivision if the land has been subdivided. So again, this is another exception. You can sell to a neighbor, whether it's a governmental entity or not. That's an exception to the bidding requirements. Or an abutting property owner, if you want to divide it in proportion to their abutting ownership, and the division must be made in an equitable manner. But again, so if you have property that you have a neighboring owner that's a business or whatever private landowner, that's an exception to you do not have to competitively procure it. Okay, the statute specifically says that you would want to always obtain, earlier when I said, well, you're going to determine your minimum bid amount. How are you going to do that? You're going to determine your minimum bid amount or your minimum sales amount if you're not going to competitively procure it by getting an appraisal. And the statute specifically says that a fair market value of land, blah, 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 is conclusively determined by an appraisal obtained by the political subdivision. So that's the main point. Once you have your appraisal, if somebody comes back and wants to haggle about the price or say, no, we'll pay you less or something, the point is that the statute says the fair market value is conclusively determined by an appraisal. One of the issues that I've dealt with in representing school districts and dealing with other governmental entities, for example, I talked about a minute ago when I said, well, hey, maybe you're going to sell to another governmental entity. You don't have to competitively bid, but you want to set the sales price. Well, the issues come up with talking about getting appraisals is when you're the seller, let's say you're going to sell your land, you get an appraisal that says the land is worth $100,000. Let's say you're going to sell to the city, you want to negotiate with the city. The city comes back and says, well, we've got an appraisal that says the property is worth $50,000. The question then becomes, well, the statute says the fair market value of land is conclusively determined by an appraisal obtained by the political subdivision. We've had this situation come up where we've been negotiating with another governmental entity for purchasing or selling land to them, and we have two conflicting, because you as a governmental entity, it's your duty to your taxpayers, go get an appraisal to determine what the property's worth, and then this other governmental entity has an appraisal that says the property's worth twice as much. So that has actually happened, and you get into that. I mean, you're trying to argue the best interest of your governmental entity, your school district, and you have this happen. What it says, what the statute says here, if you're the seller, is conclusively determined an appraisal obtained by the political subdivision. So this suggests that it's the seller's appraisal that's going to set your amount. Now, again, we've come back and negotiated with limited success, depending on how willing the other governmental entity is to work with you cooperatively, but it's really, you're just transferring property. At that point, when you're dealing with other governmental entities, you're talking about transferring money between taxpayers either way, if that's the language that you rely on, if you were to have a potential buyer come back and say, oh, what do you mean you want to sell the property for $100,000? Gee, that's really unreasonable. we've got an appraisal or the tax appraised value or something is worth half of that, where you just point them to this statute and tell them, well, sorry, but then the statute says that our appraisal is conclusive. Just wanted to give you an overview here for those of you who maybe aren't familiar, haven't reviewed appraisals before. There are 3 types of appraisals that if you were dealing with an appraiser, you would hire a certified appraiser. There's 3 of them. The cost approach, which is the current, this is the one that everybody uses, that you're most familiar with, is the sales comparison, where the appraiser goes and looks at 3 comparable properties and tries to look at similar properties and say, what are these properties worth and compared to your property? That's how you determine the value of your properties. That's called the sales comparison approach. But there's this other approach here, the cost approach, which I've seen other people try and come in and use, which is the current cost of reproducing or replacing a building minus the estimate for depreciation. So they come in and say, well, if we were going to duplicate this building, it would cost us $1 million to build it today, and then you subtract the depreciation. Again, it's not the one that's commonly used, but you might see it sometime, the cost approach. And there's this income capitalization approach, which we've seen with the value of the property's net earnings. So if it's a rental property and the seller, and this will come in, this is actually also relevant to eminent domain and condemnation, because you're also supposed to be basing it on appraisals. And then if you have the property owner, we'll talk about that later, the property owner, if you're going to get into a fight and go into court about condemning, if the property owner is saying, oh no, well my cost approach or my income capitalization approach shows that the property's worth 3 or 4 times what you're offering me based on your appraisal that's based on the sales comparison approach, it is something that you want to be aware of to be able to say, well, why are these appraisals different? Sale to an institution of higher learning. This is specified by the same section of the local government code, that a political subdivision may donate, exchange, convey, sell, or lease land or any other interest in real property to an institution of higher education. And so the statute does specifically allow you to sell it for less than fair market value if the district were inclined, or to donate. The political subdivision, you determine the terms and conditions of the transaction, effectuate and maintain the public purpose. So, you're doing it for the purpose of promoting, your educational purpose. You can donate for less than its fair market value without complying with the notice of bidding requirements of subsection A. So that's to an institution of higher learning, if that ever comes up. Sale to another political subdivision. This is what I was telling you about before. A political subdivision may donate or sell for less than the fair market value a designated parcel to another political subdivision if, now this is specific if you're doing it under this section. You could say, look, we're going to negotiate with another governmental entity and do it for fair market value. But if you wanted to justify doing it for less than fair market value, there's this particular section. So if it's going to be used by the political subdivision for carrying out a purpose that benefits the public interest of the donating or selling political subdivision. So it might be school district with the city, the school district saying we will sell to you for less than fair market value. If you agree you're going to use it for some purpose, you're going to build a library or something that's going to benefit our children or promote our educational purpose. The donation is made under terms that affect and maintain the public purpose. And you specify in there that if a buyer governmental entity, if you don't continue to use it for that governmental purpose, then the property interest reverts back to the donating entity. So this has these specific requirements where if you're going to do it for less than fair market value, you have to justify it according to these 3 requirements. Okay, this is, of course, if you were going to sell property that's been financed with the state allotment. This is just a specific of the Education Code, Section 46011, that if an instructional facility financed by bonds paid by the state or local funds is sold before the bonds are fully paid, you have to send to the comptroller a percentage of the district's net proceeds required by statute. So, it only makes sense if you're selling a property that you acquired with bonds. You just always have to be thinking about that. What was your source of funds to purchase this property you're selling? You just want to make sure. Of course, it's easiest if you've already paid it off and you own it. Just be simple. Okay, if you're this is another specific Education Code section that is specific to donation of surplus property of former school campus.
Excuse me, can we go back to that previous slide?
Yes. Thank you. But go ahead.
You said state allotment. We get 2 kinds of state allotment. get IFA, and we also get EDA.
Right.
So it says instructional facility. So if you're getting just an existing debt allotment, does that apply? Or is it just instructional facilities allotment?
Well, this section actually is specific. This is specific to instructional facility and allotments under chapter 46. So this section actually is specific to instructional facilities.
Scott, I think in 46 includes both ETA under the tax.
I think that the instructional facility line, the EPA would still be paying for that instructional facility.
Okay, so it does include EDA. So okay, well the experts.
I'm not an expert.
More expert than I
The
am.
section that deals with EDA is under 46.
Okay, well, so then the answer is going to be, yeah, I don't, this section, let's see, well, yeah, it specifies an instructional facility, but that's defined as if it was an administrative building. See,
Well,
that's
you know, what I'm saying is just because that says instructional facility, EDA also covers instructional facilities.
So,
It's just not the same, it's not in the
so it's
title.
going to be EDA and
Anything you've got
IFA.
left with.
It's actually anything you put on.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, if you
Right.
either way, part of it's common sense, although they specify it in the statute, but obviously if you borrowed money to acquire property or construct the facilities on the property, and you're going to sell that property, you want to pay back the funds that were used to purchase it or acquire it. Or
We really
construct.
didn't borrow money from the state.
Huh?
We didn't borrow money from the state. We're just getting assistance.
Well, right, but yeah, I understand, but it's either way, you're making sure that you're complying with the FOIA correctly. Yeah, but I understand it's not technically a borrow. But the okay, so this section here, donation of the surplus. You may donate real property and improvements formerly used. You can donate, so we're talking about potential donation used as a school campus to a municipality or a nonprofit organization, a county, state agency, or nonprofit organization. And this is kind of, you have to have a public hearing. The board determines that the improvements have historical significance. The transfer will further the preservation of the improvements. So you're doing it again, you're donating property primarily because it's historical in nature and somebody else, a nonprofit or another governmental entity, is going to preserve the improvements. At the time of the transfer, the district doesn't need the real property. These are all findings or determinations the board has to make. And the entity that's taking the donation intends to continue the use of real property improvements for public purpose. Okay, so that's it for that section of the government code. This next one is, the reason I put this here is you all may or may not be familiar, but there was generally a requirement for years and years that TEA had to approve the sale of any land in Texas. It was pursuant to this civil action. It was a discrimination lawsuit, civil rights lawsuit, the civil action 5281, and it was kind of the standard thing where you had to get approval of TEA to sell property. And it was one of those things we had to build in at the time when we do these. You build them into your bid specifications. You tell the buyers, hey, this is subject to approval by TEA. But the point of that is that for anybody thinking that was still around, as of 2010, subject as explained in this administrator address letter from TEA, that it's no longer required, except that there were 9. Was it 1, 2, 3, 4? I thought it was 9 school districts that were the original parties subject to this civil rights action, and those school districts, I don't think any of y'all are here, is that they still do need to get TEA approval, but none of the other ones do, and so the rest of y'all wouldn't have to do that. Okay, and that's basically it. So that's it for sale of property. Are there any questions about that?
Yeah, you refer to as a bid. Can you use a CSP to do this, or does it have to be a traditional hard bid?
It has to be a traditional hard bid. I mean, section 27201 specifically provides that it is a bid, and it is the highest bidder. I mean, they have to meet the other, whatever other specifications. I mean, I'm trying to think of if there are any other bid specifications that might non-qualify them other than being able to get financing or something like that, if you even allow them to obtain financing. But it is a bid. The CSP, there wouldn't be any negotiations on it as far as that goes. It is a sealed, the statute does specify it as a sealed bid, and you're opening the sealed bid. It is specific in that sense.
Question. Up there on that, it says land, but is that land with buildings on it or just land period that is $40,000?
It's land with buildings. I mean, it's, if you were selling facilities, I mean, the real estate with the buildings on it, it's not empty land.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you push it through in conjunction with the tax sale auction?
Push what through?
If I was selling property, it's already done public notice that type of thing. Could you just do it in conjunction and have at the auction piece of it? Like, we got our tax attorney, they do routine for the tax sale.
No, that's, okay, so you're talking about property tax foreclosure sales?
Yes.
No, this is, I'm trying to think, and we do tax collection and tax sales also. And I'm trying to think, this is a distinct process. I'm trying to think if the two overlap in a way that you could do that. I mean, this process really requires, I think specific action by the board. If you did all these steps and implemented it, the board could delegate the authority and delegate administration or attorneys to do it, but I haven't thought through if they're, obviously they'd be separate, but just doing it at the same time, like going through and doing it at the same, actually I think the answer to that though is still no, because the tax sales, for those of you all aren't familiar, if you're doing a tax foreclosure sale, it's down at the courthouse. You advertise the notice of the sale, but you go down to the courthouse, and the courthouse people are just verbally giving bids on it. And it's to the highest bidder, but they're standing there saying, okay, I'll bid $100,000, I'll bid $105,000, and I'll bid $110,000, and you bid it off to the highest bidder. These statutes specify that it is sealed bids. And so it's a different process even from that. It's not an auction type thing. That's when you said auction, it threw me off a little bit, but it is an auction basically, because you have people out there, just bidding on it. So it is a different process, and I don't think you can do it at the same time. Okay, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, what's your recommendation, or what have you seen as far as, the only reason I'm asking is because I'm getting ready to go through this process in the next couple of weeks. We have about 170 acres we're getting ready to sell. Our board wants to sell. They don't want to sell it per se. They want to go out and see what kind of bid they'll get back. Okay. We've had it for a long time, 120-some years. Yeah. And it's the greatest piece of land out there apparently. So
yeah. Okay, apparently it's like gold.
Apparently the guy before was gold.
Yeah.
But part of it, the way it's located, part of it's really retail. Part of it, the other portion of it is really going to be more of a homes. So when I set my bid up, or when I compare it against the specs, would I need to break it up in the district, or do I leave it open for anybody to make an offer on all or part, or what is the best way of doing that, or is there a best way?
Yeah. Is the property subdivided? Is it in the municipality? Do you know?
All I know is there's a bunch of vacant land that's in the city of Deer Park.
Okay, so it is all vacant land. That was my next question. Was it already developed?
No, not subdivided.
But you're saying by zoning, it's in areas.
No, it's
commercial.
There's one area on 2 main streets that is like retail high area. The retail areas want that part of the land. Okay. But the land, goes here, 2 major streets, and then it kind of goes over. Well, this section up here is really would be more home buyers, someone who wants to build a subdivision of homes. But the side over here is really going to be more for your retail, gas stations, more of a retail outlets. And so, would I need to break it out and say, bid on this piece and bid on that piece, or can I say, bid on an all or part, or what the areas you feel is best, and we'll have to sit down and have some little point system on how we?
Mike, well, first of all, yes, I believe that the district, it doesn't, the statute doesn't specify this, it doesn't specify this, but I believe the district does have the discretion to decide how to divide it up that would be most profitable is what you're looking at. And so with 27 acres, you said? 100, okay, so 100 plus acres, it probably would, I mean, it's gonna come down to what, so the statute says you can hire a real estate agent, I mean, number one, so you might wanna do that to say, okay, so and then your real estate agent's gonna be the one telling you,
he's the one telling me the retail, and the one telling me the subdivision.
Yeah, well, what's going through my mind is that what you all, the difficulty with saying, well, we're going to draw a line somewhere along this 100 plus acres of property to say this is going to be, we're going to sell this as retail or sell some of this as commercial. I don't know. It seems, you know, it'd be a real estate person would tell you this, but it would seem to me it would be more valuable by dividing it up and saying we're going to sell this for commercial development over here and sell this for residential development over here. But you'd almost need to have surveyors come in and survey and draw lines to be able to say, well, this is where we're going to draw the line. And that's where, I guess if this is this big chunk of property, it's not subdivided. I mean, I'm assuming it's not within, is it within the city limits? Because the city ought to have, again, I'm not familiar with how your park does it, but they ought to have it, you think they have it platted, like they have a plat overlay of the property where you say, okay, well, this.
I'd sell it separately.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like separating it.
Well, I think I probably get more out of it separately. But if you have someone who come in at Walmart and just, okay, I'll buy the whole thing and I'll build it and I'll sell it off later, their price is better than if I bought it separately. So I don't want to bind myself, you know what I mean?
Well, here, so the thing I'm going through in my mind is, one thing you can do, we've done it where we've advertised multiple properties for sale. These were actually different properties. There was a property in Laredo where the school district owns some historical buildings downtown, but they were separate, platted lots that the buildings were on. So we did the bid, we did the bid specifications and the alternative. As bidders, you can bid on all the properties together, or you can bid on the properties separately. And so one thing you might want to do is do alternate bids, but to do that, either, you see, what I'm thinking is, well, if you do that, are you going to want to survey the property on your own, have the district incur the cost of surveying to say, well, this is how we're going to say bidders, you can either bid on it all together, or according to our survey that we have done, we've surveyed it into 3 or 4 different chunks, and you can bid on any one of those chunks separately. And then, you know, as you know anyway, this is true with this area of law, that's true of other bids, is you can issue the bids and get responses back and not be committed to sell the property. So you don't need to worry that oh, by issuing these bids, we're committing it to creating a contract or something like that. And you could, you know, sometimes, of course, as often as not, it's more about impressions and whatever. Is even if that's not a legal requirement, you might want to put there that the district reserves the right to withdraw or cancel bids or whatever.
If you sell more than a piece of it, does he have to go on and go and sell it on the land? Or you can check them?
Yeah, and I think you can. I mean, I think absolutely the district would have that right. But again, for expectation purposes, and so that the board and everybody else understands administration and all that, you want to put in there, the district reserves the right to sell either or withdraw the bids or cancel bids as to hold or hard and go through that. But that's interesting. Yeah, I think primarily that's a little more just the issue of, you know, I want to have discussion with your real estate broker about, is there an overlay of city platting of this property or zoning? The zones, the city zones may define where if this is zoned commercially and this is a residential, then even if Walmart wanted to come in and buy the whole thing, they'd be able to.
That's
a good issue though.
In case of his situation, if he used bond money to buy that land, does he have to put the proceeds back into the bond capital project fund?
I don't know the answer to that. That would be a bond, really seriously, that would be a bond lawyer question, and I don't do bond work, and that's one of the few areas I don't do. So you know, if that's the case, but that would be, because that gets into, well, the you have this property that yeah, it's going to be a bond question that you're going to have to.
We've owned it for 33 years.
Yeah, well, right. There was,
We did have one.
yeah, I forgot. You said they've held it for decades, so that's not going to be a situation. Okay. Anything else on sale of land? Anybody? Okay. We'll go through. I mean, some of this on property acquisition is kind of technical as far as eminent domain. I thought even if you all don't handle the eminent domain aspects of it, of the condemnation procedures, I mean, obviously a lot of this is legal that a lawyer's going to handle. But it is important for you to be familiar with the concepts, and there's two major points about eminent domain that I think is very important for administration to know. Number one, the timeline. How long does it take? How long will it take? How long does it normally take? Because that's one of the things that you all are, as administration and talking with the board, communicating with the board, is you want to know, well, how long is this going to take? If you're working towards, we want to condemn some property because we need to build a school. Well, you're going to want to know your timelines for your construction of how long is it going to take to acquire these properties. And then number two is how expensive is it going to be? What is it going to cost you? Because I think there's some misconceptions. If you have not been through the eminent domain process, there's some misconceptions about the cost that might be incurred with that. So, Education Code section, the primary authority for this is 11.155. This is the section that says that a school district has the right of eminent domain to acquire fee simple title to real property to construct school buildings or any other public use necessary for the district. There's two things important about this section. Is number one, again, a couple of years ago, and I'm sure you all have done this already, is TEA came out, the legislature came out through a statute and said that all governmental entities, but including school district, needed to submit a document to the, I forget if it's a comptroller or one of the state agencies, identifying what is the basis of your authority for eminent domain. And so this was the answer to that is for school districts, it's this 11.155 of the Education Code. And then number two is that you'll see in a minute as we go on that the statutes require that here in the last few years, legislature amended and really beefed up the statutes about governmental entities exercising their rights of eminent domain, because I think there was a concern with certain constituents about governmental entities abusing their rights to acquire property from landowners. And so I don't think it was particularly directed towards school districts, but I think on concerns about the state acquiring big swaths of land for new transportation corridors and things like that, that they beefed up the rights of landowners. So one of the main things you all need to be aware of when you're talking about eminent domain, I mean, sometimes it's going to be very easy for a school district. We want to build a school. Well, obviously, that's the public use necessary for the district, constructing school buildings. If you're going to acquire it to construct administrative offices, well, that's still going to be easily supported as a public use necessary for the district. But what happens sometimes is if there was some talk about, hey, let's condemn that property over there, exercise eminent domain, we're not quite sure what we want to use it for yet, but we just think we want to take it now because we might expand on it later. That's where you're going to have maybe a concern about this, and you have to identify what the public use is. And I had that issue come up where we acquired here recently in a couple of years, in the last 2 years, a number of full block of properties along multiple residential properties that abutted a school a campus because they were expanding the campus. But then it got into this issue about we had identified the public use, but they were then administration, the construction department started talking about, hey, let's take a couple of more lots over here because we might need it for drainage for the property, but we're not sure. And I was telling them, well, guys, we need to know what we're going to do with that property because we can't just take it and say, well, we're not sure what we're going to use it for, because you do have to, as we'll see, articulate that public use for the property. So just some things that you need to be thinking about as far as being able to articulate what that public use is. Okay, so what is eminent domain? The definition. The term eminent domain refers to a governmental entity's legal authority to force a private landowner to sell his or her property for public use. When the government exercises its eminent domain authority, takes the landowner's private property, the governmental entity must pay the landowner just compensation. So that's the term just compensation when you take a private landowner's property. Okay, it's the eminent domain authority, as we were talking before. It's delegated by specific legislative statutes to state agencies, political subdivisions, and even some private entities. Okay, so that's eminent domain, because you'll hear terms of eminent domain and condemnation used interchangeably. They pretty much mean the same thing, but they do have technical differences. But anyway, the entities that are granted eminent domain authority are bound by relevant constitutional restrictions on their power, but that's not, there is constitutional provisions that limit the right or protect the rights of private landowners. Okay, so by comparison, well, what is condemnation? Condemnation refers to a procedure. So condemnation is really the procedure that governmental bodies and authorized private entities must follow when they exercise eminent domain. So that's really the difference. The eminent domain is the right to acquire property from landowners and force them to sell. Condemnation is the process you go through, or the procedures that you go through. Okay, board action to initiate eminent domain. This is where this really got beefed up here more recently by legislative action, that before the governmental entity, and this is all governmental entities, but applies to school districts, board of trustees, and it's this Texas Property Code 2112. There's multiple requirements, and we'll just go through them quickly because you all aren't going to generally be involved with the drafting of the agenda item, but it has to be recorded by a record vote at a public meeting, so obviously the board needs to take action on it in open session. It has to include a notice, that other information, that you consideration. So Chapter 551 of the Government Code is the Open Meetings Act, which just says you have to post public notice of meetings. So what that's saying, though, is that your publicly posted notice has to state the consideration of the use of eminent domain to condemn property as an agenda item. So you have to mention eminent domain, and it's just a kind of a technical requirement when you're going to condemn property. So this is where, it just goes through some technical, then you can have a single resolution. It'd be a board resolution for a school district. If for all units of the property be condemned, this is the question, well, can you combine them all together? Do you have to have separate agenda items? It's, really 6 of one, half dozen of another, but that you can put them all together, but you have to say that your record vote is going to apply to all units to be condemned, and the minutes have to reflect that the vote applies to all of the units, so you can list them all together, but you have to, have some specifics in your minutes. It gets to that if you have more than one member of your governing body object to adopting a single ordinance, so if you have 2 or more, in other words, more than one, the record vote, you have to split it up. You have to take a separate record vote to be taken on each unit. So if your board members say, no, I don't want to vote on all of them together, if there's some dispute, if administratively you all decided, well, let's put them all together under one agenda item, and then 2 board members or more say, no, we want to vote on them separately because we might not agree to exercise eminent domain on all 10 properties, so let's split it up, then you have to have a record vote on the one separately. So if 2 or more units are owned by the same person, you must treat those units of property as one unit. That's just, again, a technical requirement. The motion, it specifies the wording of the motion, and so you get that again, you're mentioning that apparently there were governmental entities out there that were kind of trying to do it in a kind of less clear way that you were exercising eminent domain. So the legislature has said that you have to specifically state that you're exercising the power of eminent domain, and then how you have to describe the properties. But so that's just something, if you have your lawyers talking about, no, we have to word it this way, you understand why it has to mention eminent domain. Now this is where you, let's see, that if the project for public use is going to acquire multiple tracts of property, this is really, I'm not sure that this is going to be specific. This is like if you were doing a roadway or highways or something, and you're going to be covering large swaths of land that you're doing it for these multiple tracts, and then it's going to go on connecting, the facilities connecting one location to another, and so that, I'm not sure that applies to you all or not, but that by record vote can delegate authority to initiate the proceedings to a chief administrative officer. Now that does apply, but this is really saying that if you're going to do it in parcels, you're go along and do it over a period of time, the board can delegate the authority to do that. Okay, you're not required to identify specific properties, but you must identify at least the general area. So you don't have to necessarily use the legal description of each and every property, but like if we're talking about this 100 acres or something, you could use a broader general area description. That it's a way that provides property owners in and around the area or along the route reasonable notice that the owner's properties may be subject to condemnation proceedings. So, okay, so then the process is that the statutes say once the board says, yes, we want to exercise eminent domain, what's the next thing that happens? One of the next things that happens is the governmental entity makes what's called a bona fide, some people pronounce that bona fide if you're technically speaking Latin, but I call it bona fide offer, and there's requirements for that bona fide offer. In other words, you are required to make an offer before you say, okay, we're gonna proceed to condemn your property. You have to make an offer. And that offer, and there's consequences if you don't, that we'll talk about. You have to make a bona fide offer. The procedure is that that's the same thing basically. So the bona fide offer is the elements of the bona fide offer. Okay, you have to make a first offer in writing to the property owners. You make a first offer. You have to make at least a second offer, which can be your final offer. You can make other offers in between. But at some point, you have to get to the point where in writing, you tell the property owner, this is our final offer. And that's where, but that means that you do have to have an initial offer. It has to be at least two of them. You have to say, here's our first and here's our last. And the second, and they can be the same, and it doesn't necessarily have to change, but you do have to call it your final offer. There's some requirements for the final offer, is that it has to be made at least 30 days after your initial offer, so there has to be a 30-day time period in between them. You have to get a written appraisal from a certified appraiser, and that states the value. But anyway, you're getting a certified appraisal, and that you're going to, as we see here, I think it says, but you have to provide a copy of that in your final offer. So if you did do it, a lot of times the governmental entity, you'll do it in your initial offer, just do it all together. You say, here's our offer, here's the appraisal that we got. And it is better to have the appraisal, of course, before you even make your initial offer. But by the time you make your final offer, you have to have your appraisal. The final offer has to be equal or greater to the amount of the written appraisal. So your final offer cannot be less than your written appraisal. Which is, the point about that is that's interesting is your initial offer can be lower than your final offer. So it's not a problem if you lowball, and we're going to talk about lowballing here in a second, but you can lowball your initial offer. You can say if the property's worth $100,000, you can offer $50,000. But by the time, if the property owner accepts it, you may be done. You're like, hey, we offered them $50,000, they took $50,000 or $60,000. Great, we've got a bargain on it. But if the landowner says, no, I'm not going to accept that, no, I'm not going to accept it, by the time you make your final offer has to be, you say, here's our appraisal then, and this offer is at least equal to the appraisal that's there. So, okay, so then these are things that have to be included with the final offer, the written appraisal, a copy of the deed that you're going to use. So you have to say, here's the deed we're going to use. A Bill of Rights statement that's required by statute. This is a form. It's, again, you can get it off the internet. You can get it from the website. It's just the landowner's Bill of Rights. It's a written list of states what their rights are. And then you have to give the property owner at least 14 days to respond. And that if the property owner does not agree to the terms of the final offer within that period. So you have to give them at least 14 days to respond to that. Okay, so that's your bona fide offer. Okay, so what does it mean that you made this bona fide offer? The statute says, the statute calls it this bona fide offer, your final offer. And we're talking about the final offer, not that initial offer. So at the end, when you make your final second bona fide offer, here's the reason you shouldn't lowball it, because if the commissioners, and we'll talk about when you condemn, we'll go through this in a second, but when you condemn, when you file, it's filing a lawsuit for condemnation. You're going to court and you're filing a lawsuit to condemn the property to exercise eminent domain. You file it in state district court. When you file it in state district court, what the judge does, the statute says that you have, the judge appoints commissioners that are supposed to be just landowners in your area, in your jurisdiction. And the point of that is supposed to be that if the government is going to take your property, we were talking about the background of that, if the government's going to take your property, it's really going to be these 3 commissioners that are going to decide what the value of that is. The commissioners don't decide whether or not the governmental entity is legally entitled to take the property. They just decide what the value is going to be. And the point is, of course, that it's sort of like having a jury of your peers, your representatives of your community. It's not the judge, it's not the government, it's your landowners, other people that are going to determine the value. So that, when it's reference to the commissioners, I was just explaining what that is. But if you make a lowball offer, and so you lowballed it, and the commissioners come back and say, well, no, you only offered $50,000, but this property is worth $100,000. Well, okay, you say, well, so what? If we come back and the commissioners tell us it's $100,000, well, what's the problem with that? Well, again, the problem is that the commissioners can award attorney's fees against the district and award the property owner's attorney's fees, and also award the property owner's attorney's fees against the district. So you could end up paying $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 of the landowner's attorney's fees, because otherwise, that's one thing, and you'll see there's a lot of other things now that the property owners are entitled to get paid, but one thing they are not entitled to get paid is their attorney's fees. So if you go to court with them, if you've made a good offer, and they say, well, but okay, you're going to pay me the value of the land, but I'm going to incur attorney's fees. You have to pay me my attorney's fees. You say, no, we don't have to pay your attorney's fees, except if you made too low of an offer. If you made too low of an offer, then the commissioners could award you the other side's attorney's fees. So you do have to be careful about that. And this is where, really, we're talking about that. The commissioners will be considering the competing appraised values of the property. So the landowner, if they're going to fight it, realistically, the landowner has to go to court with their own appraiser or somebody who's going to talk about the value of the property being more. And that's where you're going to have to consider, well, our appraisal says that this is not the sale of property anymore. I mean, you're acquiring property, so that rule about your appraisal setting the absolute price of the property is not true here. That the commissioners will be able to consider the information that the landowner brings about the value of the property and the information the school district brings about the value of the property and make a decision. So you want to know, if you have an appraisal that says the property is worth $100,000 and the other side has information they give you says, no, we think the property is worth $200,000, you're going to have to figure out what you want to offer. I mean, you want to be safe and say, well, we'll offer the full $200,000. You say, no, that's a crazy number they made up, or their appraisers, in cahoots with them or something. We're only going to offer them $175 or $150, or we're going to stick with our appraisal that's $100,000, and we're not going to offer a penny more than that. Well, I mean, I'll tell you from my experience, the commissioners were 3 landowners in this area, and there's 3 members of the community. They're at least going to split the difference. So you got to be thinking about that. And if they did split the difference and you didn't award more than your appraisal, the commissioners could end up awarding the attorney's fees to the landowner. So that's just, and their costs. The court costs aren't going to be that much, but the attorney's fees can be tens of thousands of dollars. And if it's a big commercial dispute, if you're talking about multi-million-dollar property or $1 million worth of property or something, the attorney's fees could be $100,000 or something like that, depending on how big the fight is. So that's something you have to be aware of. So now we go back to that filing the condemnation petition in state court. There's a lot of requirements, technical details about what the petition has to have in it. I didn't include that because you all aren't going to be involved in that. But this is just, as I was explaining before, if the entity with eminent domain authority wants to acquire property, but you're unable to agree with the owner, then the entity begins the condemnation proceeding by filing a petition in the proper court. So that's what I was saying a minute ago. That's the point where the appointment of commissioners by the judge, that the judge appoints 3 disinterested property owners. Of course, they can't be relatives of the landowners that you're trying to condemn, who reside in the county as special commissioners to assess the damages. Again, that's the only issue that these commissioners are deciding, is to assess the damages. And that you have an opportunity you can strike one of the 3. Each side has the right to strike one of the 3. So you say, oh no, that person really hates governmental entities or is really a property rights advocate, he's going to stick to us, so you can object to that person. But that, then the judge appoints a replacement, so I mean, you don't know, the judge still has the right to appoint a replacement, so hopefully the judge isn't going to be trying to make it a bad situation for the school district. So here, now this gets into your schedule. You say, okay, how long does this take? We've already gone back. I mean, if we back up here a minute, so you remember, you have to make your initial offer. Then you have to wait 30 days for your final offer. Then you have to wait 14 days after your final offer before you can begin the condemnation proceedings, before you can file your condemnation petition. So that's already 45 days, okay? So start thinking about how long is this taking. So that's 45 days. So then the judge appoints the commissioners. What the statute says is that after the commissioners are appointed, they have to schedule a hearing that is prompt, but not earlier than 20 days. So that, but think about this. That's after the commissioners are appointed. They're supposed to promptly schedule a hearing, but they have to give the parties at least 20 days notice. But that didn't say how long the judge has to appoint the commissioners. So the judge, can sit on, it depends on how fast, efficient your judge is, but the judge may or may not sit on it. So if the judge waits a week, 2 weeks, 30 days to appoint your commissioners, that might be another 30 days. We had our 45 days. If you factor in another 30 days, and then you've got at least 20 days before your hearing can be held. And that's if they schedule it right away. So you have the 45 days, 30, another 20. I mean, you're already looking at a period here, at least 3 months along the way here. So again, that's things to be thinking about of how fast does this happen. Now, this has to do with, this is just, keep that in mind about the three-month time period where we were at already, and I'll talk to you about the rest of the process. This is just another technicality here about that information you have to provide to the owner at the time of acquisition is, this is where you have to tell them that the owner or their successors, whoever, that they have the right to repurchase the property if it's, and we'll talk about that, but, and they have right to request from the entity, this would be the school district, information relating to the use of the property and any actual progress made towards that use. Now what this means is, we'll jump ahead, is that what the law says now is that the governmental entity, the school district, has 10 years to use the property for the purpose that you said you were going to use it for. If you don't do it within those 10 years, like let's say, okay, we're going to acquire 100 acres because we're going to start building, and then our next phase is we're going to build this school, and the next phase is going to be we're going to add on something else, and we're going to add on this, and we're going to build our administrative building in the future. But I don't know, it drags out, or there's other delays, you can't get your funding for it, your financing, you're waiting to save more money. If 10 years goes by and you have not actually used the property for what you said you were going to use it for, the landowners have the right to take it back. And that's why it says, or successors, because I mean, it can be 10 years later, the original owners may have passed away. But so anyway, there's a 10-year time period there where you have to use the property for the purposes that you said you were going to use it for. Okay, this is the repurchase price over that 10-year period. That we're talking about 10 years later, the statute changed it to say that the repurchase price is the price that was originally paid at the time you acquired the property, and it's not the fair market price at the time that the public use was canceled. So that's kind of important for the governmental entity, because 10 years later, if the value of that property has exploded or multiplied over the years, the governmental entity, I mean, this is a little bit sticking it to the landowner, because it says, well, the district doesn't have to pay more than you originally paid for it. So when you condemned it, if you paid $100,000, but 10 years later the property's worth $1 million, you still only have to pay them back the $100,000 for them to take it back. So anyway, that's that's better for the landowner. Yeah, I got that switched around. But that's better for the landowner, because the district's saying, we have to give you back the property, landowner. But instead of being able to say, pay us what it is worth now, 10 years later, say, oh no, you only have to pay us back what we paid for originally. So yeah, that doesn't
Can the parties agree that this provision doesn't apply?
Yes, I haven't had that issue come up, but I'm sure you could. I mean, there's no reason that if you contractually, let's say you said, that would go back to contract law, but I'd say if you gave them consideration for that, if you said, okay, and again, be kind of a legal technicality to it, you'd say, okay, look, the landowner, we're going to have this agreement. The property is worth $100,000. We're going to pay you $100,000 for that. Now, so that we don't have to worry about this, we're going to pay you an additional $10,000 to buy your right to say that you waive your right forever and you're on behalf of your heirs and assigns and your successors and everybody else. I believe you can do that. I mean, there's no reason to think you can. I mean, the statute doesn't say you can, but the important thing would be not to say, hey, landowner, we're going to pay you $100,000 for the property, and will you please include in there that you're giving up the right. You'd want to very specifically say, we're giving you some additional value contractually for you to release that right that you have. So that would be my caveat on that. Okay, this goes to the expenses that are awarded. Now, I kind of skipped, I didn't get into in this presentation the technical process of the court action of the condemnation. But going back to that time period, because this really gets into the dollar amounts. There were the two aspects of it, the time period and then how much you end up having to pay. The time period from there, let's just talk about that a little bit separately. So you're already at about a 3-month period. The commissioners meet. We said the commissioners have to give at least 20 days notice of their hearing to meet to decide what the value is going to be. But then let's think about this, because what happens in court is then the commissioners have that hearing, the parties present their evidence, and the commissioners, even if they decide that day, which they don't necessarily have to actually decide that day, they can come back and decide the next day or the next day, and it depends how long the hearing goes on. But once they decide on the value, either party has the right to object to that value. Now, what the law says is that the governmental entity has the right, school district would have the right to come in. But the point is that either the landowner or the governmental entity has the right to come in and say, well, we don't like that dollar amount that the commissioners picked. But if the landowner, and you have an automatic right to do that, but so you might say, well, shoot, if the landowner can come in, if you have this commissioner's hearing and the landowner comes in and just has an automatic right to object to that, I mean, landowner could do it just to be contrary, just to cause delay, and knowing that that's going to put pressure on the district to have to pay more money. What the law says is that the district can come in and tender that dollar amount at that time. The district can come in and say, so if the commissioners say, we place the value at $150,000, and the landowner said, no, I'm certain that it's worth at least $500,000, and they want to fight about it, the district can come in and put down can deposit the $150,000 that the commissioners awarded. They can pay that amount and take possession of the property and go forward with it, even though you're going to continue arguing in court about the full value. So that, in other words, so the law allows the governmental entity to take possession of the property even though you're still fighting about the dollar amount. And the point about that is, if you think about it, is that at the end of the day, the landowner doesn't have the right to stop the condemnation. He doesn't have the right to stop the exercise of eminent domain. They only have the right to argue about how much money they're entitled to get. Because it really, as long as the governmental entity is identifying a public use, a public purpose, that's where a lot of the fights about the right to exercise eminent domain arise. But if it's unequivocally, the school district's going to build a school, there's absolutely no argument about the public purpose. The only thing the landowner can do is argue about how much money they're going to get. And so they can't stop the process or delay it beyond getting to that point of the commissioner issuing the award and having that final thing. Then the district can come in and deposit that amount of money and proceed to take possession of the property and go forward from that point. So at least at that point, you're probably going to be talking about, I mean, I would factor in at least 6 months because we were already talking about 3-4 months, somewhere around there. And if you're talking about delays and scheduling things or whatever, you're generally going to be talking about probably at least 6 months before you can take possession of the property. So that's a good ballpark of that time period. So if you had to factor in that, okay, we're going to do construction of a new school and we want to acquire this property, how much time do we need to know when we're going to be able to even begin construction, much less complete the school, and so factoring that in and all that. So I'd say it's about a 6-month time period.
John, I might miss it at the beginning. Can this process take place even if the property is homesteaded?
Yes.
That just seems somewhat illegal to me. I'm just saying.
I know, and right. You
That's
take, his family could have been there for
Right.
500 years, and it's their homestead, their primary residence. It's a residential property.
I mean, said Deer Park could sell that property and then go decide that they're going to plop that money, take that money that they just made and plop it in some residential area and say, we're taking it.
Exactly. They could say, well, this empty land here we don't like because we like this entire block of homes over here that have 20 people living on it, and we're gonna just take that money and condemn it and force you people to leave. I was involved in the condemnation of a half of a city block or residential area that involved, I don't know, I think 10 or 12 properties of different homes of people who, my mother, I grew up here, this is the home we grew up in, and but they needed it, the district needed it, and it, now the good point will be when we get to what they get paid now, because they get compensated much more than they used to. And I'm running a little behind on schedule, so let me move ahead on this. But what happened was the big change was, okay, so talk about unfairness. The big change used to be 10 years ago, if you condemn somebody's home, you said, okay, we're condemning it, we're going to give you the fair market value. Here's our appraisal, here's the fair market value of what your house is worth. And that's all we have to pay you. So we have our appraisal, and you have an appraisal, but those appraisals are arguing about what is the fair market value of that property that you're in. And let's say it's Laredo, Texas, for example. Laredo is kind of divided between the older part of town and newer areas that are growing and that the property values are much higher. But so, that landowner back 10 years ago, you'd say, okay, your house is worth $100,000 and that's what we're paying you. If the landowner said, okay, well, that's all well and good, yes, that's what that property is worth, but I can't go buy a new house for less than $150,000. So you're paying me for what my house is worth here, but that's not enough to get me into a new home. 10 years ago was, we're sorry, you're out of luck. That's all even legally we can pay you. That's what the law says we can pay you. We can pay you the fair market value of your current property that we are taking from you. Okay, that's changed now, and that's mainly the main point I wanted to get across to you all is what the district has to pay now to these people includes relocation expenses, and that you have to provide relocation advisory services for these individuals, families, businesses, when you relocate them as a result of condemnation. So this Texas state, the Texas Property Code has now incorporated this Federal Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970, which is what provides for these relocation expenses. And as you see in a second, that is what really can almost double your expenses of what you have to pay to acquire these properties. Because it is no longer just, here's your fair market value, it's paying them for the cost of relocating to another property, moving expenses, the value of another property, and so we'll get into that. It's mandatory to pay moving expenses and rental supplements, relocation payments, financial assistance to acquire replacement housing, this compensation for expenses incident to the transfer of property. It applies to an individual, this is what we said before. Now, really, here's the point is that now this right here, that you have to provide relocation advisory services, either if your district is growing and has this type of service, I don't know if you all do this, if you do it on a regular basis, you either need to have somebody within your district get trained on this and be able to provide this yourself, or you're going to have to hire a consultant, an outside service to do this for you. Or if your law firm is trained, the law firm can get trained in this and have somebody do it. But either way, you have to have somebody trained in relocation advisory services because it is somewhat technical. And the application and interpretation of these rules and what are called now displacees, the people that you're displacing as a result of the condemnation. And so we go through here and list here, well, what do you have to pay on moving expenses, and you're determining, well, what's a legitimate moving expense or not, relocation payments, what does the relocation payments mean? These are all technical terms, but I'll give you an example of, so one thing that you do now, we've already gone through this list. So one thing you do now is instead of, so again, you're saying, well, we're going to pay you for the fair market value of your house. Well, that's not even really, I mean, you're not even really paying them for you're paying them for the difference. Not only do you consider the fair market value of the property that you're condemning, but then you go look at, as part of this relocation services, somebody has to go do a market analysis and say, you have to actually identify properties that are replacement properties for these people. And so if it was a home and it was a 3-bedroom home, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, you have to go identify other 3-bedroom, 2-bath homes that this family could actually move into. They have to be available on the market. They have to, if a member of the family is handicapped, for example, has disabilities, you have to make sure that the replacement home is handicapped accessible, is appropriate for disability. It's all sorts of, I mean, it has to be a comparable property. Again, it has to be the 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Over here, it has to be at least a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. The properties, again, have to be available for them to move into. So somebody has to go and basically identify, they have to act as a real estate agent and go identify what those properties are. You can use the services of a real estate agent for that, but again, they have to be trained to know how those properties match up to the property that you're condemning. Here's the other thing that again starts to add up. If you're condemning, let's say you're condemning a residential property here, and either there's a tenant, that property was residential but they're leasing to somebody, or maybe there's a family that lives in this property and they're renting the garage behind them, the garage apartment, they're renting to another family. You actually have, for that one property, you have 2 different displacees that you have to pay money to, and you have to compensate for being relocated because they're both being displaced, so they're both called displacees. So now for that one property, you have maybe two different families you have to deal with. One was the owner of the property, and the other one was the tenant of the property. So, and that's where you have to pay them both. So you're like, wait a minute, we were condemning 3 properties here, but now we're dealing with 6 families. How did we get into this situation? We thought we thought when we estimated how much we were going to have to pay, we just had appraisals done of these 3 properties, and it was $100,000 each, but we thought we were only going to have to pay $300,000. Oh no, well now it turns out that these replacement costs, because the housing market in Houston is getting so bad, in Harris County, that now we're going to have to pay, that they can't get into a new house for less than $200,000 each. So now and we have to pay moving expenses and all this other junk, so now we're looking at paying $600,000 or $700,000 or $800,000. And so that's the main point, is that you do have to have somebody that's trained in this relocation assistance to be giving you, nowadays I would take at least your fair market value. Say you've got appraisal, we want to condemn this property here. I would take that fair market value, and if you, well, I mean, it depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about a business, and if it's a $1 million property, we're not going to double that. But when we were condemning properties that were worth approximately $150,000, we ended up having to basically double that amount to know how much we actually ended up paying. So you're going to have to do some ballpark, or at least work with, if you really wanted to budget that up front, you're going to have to talk to somebody that's experienced and trained in this relocation assistance program. And even then, they're going to tell you, because I've been through this, they're going to tell you that, well, we really can't even give you a good estimate of what you're going to have to pay, because we have to know the different characteristics of the displacees, and do you have tenants, and do you have people, again, with disabilities, because then you might have to make improvements to the house that they're going to move into to accommodate those disabilities, even if the house they were in didn't accommodate those disabilities. So there's a lot of financial impact that to avoid surprises if you're thinking about acquiring property through eminent domain that you have to think about. So again, getting into this relocation assistance program, that you shall provide, this is just going back again, and you have to provide this relocation assistance that, okay, we're wrapping up here. This, but on the other hand, you're not supposed to, you can't pay more that exceeds payments authorized under this relocation assistance, the federal statute. So you can't just throw money at them. It does have to be based on calculations according to statute, which again means you need to be using somebody who's trained and familiar with that. This was my point about a displacee, which is the term they use under the statute. It's not only the owners, but also tenants. The definition is if a person moves or discontinues the person's business, moves personal property, moves the person's dwelling. So all this means that it includes tenants, not just, it's more encompassing than just owners. The owner's right to repurchase is what we talked about a minute ago, and that's the end of it. So, any questions about that? Acquiring property, eminent domain, condemnation. Okay, well, you've got a good overview and a basis for that, and I appreciate you.
Has one of the largest number of child sexual abuse cases in the United States. We are one of the largest advocacy centers in Harris County. Our numbers compared to Chicago, Los Angeles, and the 5 boroughs of New York. The larger the population, the more child sexual abuse cases you have. We have 65 advocacy centers in the state of Texas. We're divided by county. So, of course, Harris County is the largest county. Montgomery County, Galveston, Liberty County, Brazoria County, they all have their own Fort Bend, they all have their own advocacy center. The training that you're about to receive is for Region 6 of Texas. So we're providing this training free of charge for school districts in Region 4. I have been dying to do a prevention project. The schools have been telling me we're not paying for it, we don't have the budget for it. So we got a sponsor out of Austin that said, hey, I'll pay for 5% of 5 regions in the state of Texas. I don't want to send a cent back to him. 5% is very small. However, in Harris County, it's 4,150 school staff, and I want to meet that. We are halfway there. We have another half to go, and I'm hoping that you all will communicate to your school districts this opportunity, this resource that is available to school staff, teachers, other staff that are in the schools themselves. So you're going to see a sample of it. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the questions we normally ask during the training because I'm going to try to get you all on course. So please feel free to ask me any questions if you have during the training. I'll be glad to answer them. Child sexual abuse is not an easy topic. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Texas has the largest amount of child sex abuse. Is that on per capita basis or just by number?
By number. And we look at the county, it's looking at the county. Harris County has the largest number for the state of Texas. Texas does not have the largest. It depends on what year actually we look at it. But our numbers compare with the top 3 or 4 advocacy centers are Houston, California, Los Angeles, California, Chicago, and New York City.
Why do you think we have the largest?
The larger population, the larger the number of child abuse cases. So when you're dealing with a large population, what we're seeing is the larger number of child sexual abuse cases that you have, as well as physical abuse and neglect cases also. That stands true. So the larger the population, the more cases that you see. Okay? So what do you have in front of you? What am I providing for you that people that is being sponsored by our sponsor in Austin? You have a booklet. The teachers and school staff can use this as a resource. I encourage them when I go out to the schools to do training that they go into their groups and discuss the questions that I don't review because it starts the conversation. Child sexual abuse is a difficult topic. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, don't want to think about it, but that when we do that or allow ourselves or our staff to do that, we also allow children to be unseen that are being actually abused. So this will encourage communication between the school members. In your package, you have the one-pager that tells you about the program that we are offering for Region 6, free of charge. So you can share that with your superintendents or school personnel. Also, in your packet that you have, the booklet that was given to you, you have information about the Texas Educator's Guide to Reporting Suspected Abuse. We're also sharing that with school staff. From the Children's Assessment Center, you have the 10 signs of abuse. And when you flip it, you have the do's and don'ts for the school staff or teachers to know if a child actually comes to them and reports abuse. Not only sexual abuse, but any form of abuse. And it's a great tip card for them to keep close. Also, how do the schools sign up for the training? It's simple. There's a one-sheeter that looks like this. It's a registration form. It has my number and email. All they have to do is tell me when our facilitators can come out. Harris County has 21 trained facilitators that can do this training. So all they have to do is fill this out and return it to me. And we will find the facilitators to come out on the date they choose on their campus to provide the training. And we will have the booklets at no charge to the school district, as long as we're trying to reach to that 5%. In your packet,
time frame for that?
end of August, I'm glad you asked. We will be providing this training until the end of August. The certificate the teachers receive, you have a sample also in your booklet. Also, we do pre-test and post-test. The pre-test and post-test you have a copy of, and I would love for you to fill that out while we're going through the training. If you would fill out the pre-test, break it from the other two sheets, and when you finish it, if you would send it to the end of your table, and I will pick those up. At the end of the course, I'll ask you to do the post-test. So with all of that said, I want to go ahead and get started with the training. We're going to do part 1 of the training. Please listen, we have a lot of testimonials. I've done trainings for schools, but unfortunately, when they call the Children's Assessment Center, it's after the fact, after a child has disclosed sexual abuse or after an incident has happened in the school. The Children's Assessment Center sees everyday children that are being sexually abused. The largest number of children we see are being sexually abused by family members, someone they know, trust, and love. Okay, that's a very large percent. What we're seeing more of is teacher-related child sexual abuse cases. Coaches, teachers, again, someone that child trusts, okay? So we want to get out and, offer support, offer resources for the schools, because we have to keep our eyes and ears open at all times so we can protect children, okay? So child sexual abuse in the family, in the schools, as well as stranger-related cases. We're seeing a lot more human trafficking cases, internet crime cases. So we want to make the schools more aware of the dynamics when it comes to internet crimes as well as human trafficking, because we're seeing more of that, and we're having to specialize in our therapy and psychological services more to address human trafficking as well as internet crime cases. So again, I want you to pay attention to the testimonials. These are all adults that were sexually abused as children. Some of the information is not easy to hear, but I want you to realize and recognize these are people that look like us, that can be related to us, and how they are manipulated by the trust and love and innocence of their age when they were abused.
I grew up in the picture-perfect family. I was called the debutante Miss America. I was the first Miss America that they ever brought a family up on stage. My father continued to sexually violate children and teenagers until he died at age 75.
I still cannot even say what really happened, other than he had sexual acts with me and had me perform it, but I still can't say it. I mean, I don't know if I ever will.
And that's what I feel that was taken from me. My virginity, my youth. You're never the same after that.
What I've heard from people who abuse often is that all the signs were there, but no one bothered to ask them about it. No one in their family, no one in their work. And we need to learn how to see what's going on and begin to ask questions.
Whether you're a mandated reporter or not, it's your moral obligation to stand up for children.
We have to understand that doing the right thing is not doing the easy thing.
Law enforcement is never going to investigate their way out of these type of crimes, these crimes against children. It's only through prevention that we can help stem the tide.
If you spare one child, I mean, people don't have a clue the ripples from one child. So you stop one source of ripples, I mean, that is huge.